The House Where We Learned to Stay. Volume 1, A New Home. 29-year-old best-selling novelist Seo Minjae has always been good at living alone. He likes quiet apartments, late-night writing sessions, coffee instead of breakfast, days when he doesn't have to speak to anyone except his editor. Then his daughter is born. 6 weeks later, Minjae barely recognizes his own life. Little Seo Haneul is healthy, precious, beautiful, and apparently determined to ensure her father never sleeps again. After becoming Haneul's sole parent, Minjae tries desperately to prove that he can handle everything himself. Feeding, diapers, laundry, doctor appointments, housework, deadlines. He creates schedules. He reads parenting books. He watches videos. He sets alarms. He writes down every bottle Haneul drinks. And slowly, quietly, he exhausts himself. Minjae loves his daughter more than anything in the world. But loving Haneul doesn't automatically teach him how to raise her. When his publisher begins asking about his increasingly overdue manuscript and Minjae realizes he has spent another night sitting beside Haneul's crib because he was afraid to stop watching her breathe, he finally admits something has to change. His late grandmother left behind an old house in the countryside village of Hidamri. Minjae remembers summers there as a child, open fields, quiet mornings, clean air, and a tiny house surrounded by trees. Maybe that is what Haneul needs. Maybe it is what he needs too. So Minjae packs their lives into boxes and leaves Seoul. He imagines peaceful mornings writing beside an open window while Haneul naps. Reality is less cooperative. The house is dusty. The garden is overgrown. There are insects everywhere. The nearest large supermarket requires a drive. The villagers are extremely curious about the mysterious young man who arrived carrying a newborn. And then there is Kong Taewon. 31 years old, Taewon manages his family's orchard and has become Hidamri's unofficial handyman. Their first meeting couldn't possibly go worse. Minjae catches a strange man walking through his yard and assumes he's trespassing. Taewon, meanwhile, hears Haneul crying inside and assumes the exhausted-looking city man has irresponsibly left his newborn unattended. Accusations are exchanged, tempers flare, and before either man can properly understand what happened, they have already decided they dislike each other. Then Haneul stops crying in Taewon's arms. Minjae considers this a personal betrayal. Unfortunately, Taewon lives nearby. Even more unfortunately, Minjae quickly discovers countryside life requires skills he absolutely does not possess. When something breaks, Taewon appears. When Minjae's stroller becomes trapped in mud, Taewon helps. When Minjae nearly loses a battle against an unassembled crib, Taewon fixes it. When Minjae forgets to eat, vegetables mysteriously appear outside his door. And when Haneul becomes sick for the first time since their move, Taewon is the person standing beside Minjae when fear overwhelms him. Their hostility slowly becomes familiarity. Familiarity becomes friendship. Taewon gradually learns Minjae isn't an irresponsible father. He's simply a frightened new parent trying desperately to do everything correctly. And Minjae discovers that Taewon's blunt personality hides extraordinary patience and kindness. But this is not primarily the story of Minjae falling in love. It is the story of Minjae learning to become Haneul's father. He learns that babies don't follow schedules. That mistakes don't automatically make him a bad parent. That asking for help isn't failure. That his career can change without disappearing. That a house doesn't have to be perfectly organized to be a good home. And that raising a child doesn't have to be something he survives alone. By the end of their first summer in Hidamri, Minjae has changed. Haneul is growing. His manuscript is finished. The villagers who once felt like intrusive strangers have become familiar faces. And the annoying man next door has somehow become the person Minjae trusts most. Neither Minjae nor Taewon is ready to call what exists between them love. Not yet. For now, it is something quieter. A chair that Taewon automatically pulls beside Minjae. An extra cup of coffee Minjae prepares without thinking. A baby who recognizes both their voices. And a countryside house that finally begins to feel like home. Chapter 1, 6 Weeks Without Sleep. At exactly 3:17 a.m., Seo Minjae gave up trying to guess why his daughter was crying. He stood in the middle of his tiny Seoul apartment with 6-week-old Haneul cradled against his shoulder, gently patting her back while swaying from side to side. "It's okay." His voice was hoarse from lack of sleep. "It's okay, Haneul. Haneul strongly disagreed. Wah, Minjae sighed. Right, not okay. He shuffled around the apartment for what felt like the 100th time that night. The living room looked less like the home of a best-selling novelist and more like the aftermath of a very polite disaster. Open parenting books were stacked on the coffee table. A half-finished manuscript sat abandoned on his laptop. Empty coffee mugs occupied nearly every flat surface. Freshly washed baby bottles dried on a rack beside the sink. Tiny socks hung over the back of a chair. A folded stroller leaned against the wall. Laundry filled one corner. Diapers filled another. The only things perfectly organized were Haneul's supplies. Everything else had surrendered. Minjae glanced at the clock. 3:19 a.m. He had fed her, changed her diaper, burped her twice, checked her temperature, rocked her, sang to her, walked around the apartment, played white noise, opened a parenting app, closed the parenting app after it suggested, remain calm. I am calm, he muttered. Haneul cried louder. I'm trying to be calm. He carefully shifted her into both arms. Her tiny face was red from crying. Her little fists were clenched tightly. His heart squeezed. I know. He kissed the top of her soft hair. I know something's bothering you. If only she could tell him what it was. 6 weeks. It had only been 6 weeks since she entered his life. Before that, silence, routine, writing until sunrise if inspiration struck, ordering takeout whenever he forgot meals, sleeping until noon after finishing a chapter. His biggest problem had been deciding whether his detective should suspect the butler or the lawyer. Now he celebrated if he managed to drink an entire cup of coffee while it was still warm. Life changed frighteningly fast. Haneul hiccuped between cries. Minjae frowned. Hungry again. No, she had eaten less than an hour ago. He checked her diaper anyway. Still clean. He gently touched her forehead. Normal. Too warm. Too cold. He wasn't sure anymore. He picked up the digital thermometer. 36.7 degrees. Normal. He looked at Haneul. She looked back. Then resumed crying. Minjae sighed dramatically. You know. He carried her toward the kitchen. I've written 6 novels. Haneul offered no opinion. Over 2 million copies sold. Still crying. My editor once called me a genius. Wah. Apparently not in this field. He almost laughed. Almost. Instead he opened the refrigerator. Rows of carefully labeled breast milk storage bags filled one shelf. Formula stood neatly arranged beside them. He had become frighteningly good at sterilizing bottles. He could assemble one in under 30 seconds. If someone ever organized a competitive bottle-making championship, he was confident he'd place well. It wasn't exactly the skill he'd imagined developing before turning 30. Another cry echoed through the apartment. He quickly prepared another bottle just in case. Haneul accepted it eagerly. For exactly 23 seconds. Then she pushed it away and cried again. Minjae blinked. You asked for this. Haneul disagreed. He looked toward the ceiling. I would like to file a complaint. Silence. Not from Haneul. From the universe. It ignored him. Again. By 4:11 a.m., Minjae had resorted to reading aloud. The old detective stared at the bloodstain on the carpet and realized someone had carefully rearranged the crime scene. Haneul's cries softened slightly. Encouraged, Minjae continued reading from his unfinished manuscript. The murderer wanted everyone to notice the obvious clue because. Haneul sneezed, then blinked sleepily. Minjae smiled. Oh, he kept reading, not because he thought a murder mystery interested a 6-week-old baby. Because she seemed calmer hearing his voice. The truth is usually much quieter than people expect. Her tiny eyelids fluttered. Her breathing slowed. Finally, she fell asleep. Minjae froze. Every parent knew this moment. The transfer. The impossible mission. Move the sleeping baby without waking the sleeping baby. He slowly bent toward the crib. 1 centimeter. 2. 3. He lowered her carefully onto the mattress. Removed one hand. Then the other. Success. He took exactly 1 victorious step backward. Wah. Minjae closed his eyes. Of course. He picked her up again immediately. Haneul settled the instant she returned to his arms. Apparently the crib itself had personally offended her. I understand. He leaned against the sofa. We'll negotiate with the crib tomorrow. Or next year. Whichever came first. The first light of dawn slowly slipped through the apartment window. The city outside began waking. Cars appeared below. People hurried toward buses. Somewhere nearby, a bakery opened. Minjae hadn't slept. Again. Haneul now slept peacefully against his chest, one tiny hand gripping his shirt. He didn't dare move. Instead, he simply looked at her. 6 weeks ago, he had been terrified to even hold her. She had looked impossibly small. Fragile. Like she might break if he breathed too hard. Every nurse in the hospital had seemed more confident than he was. He remembered his shaking hands. The fear. The overwhelming certainty that someone had made a terrible mistake by trusting him with an entire human being. Even now, the fear hadn't disappeared. Every night he checked whether she was breathing. Sometimes twice. Sometimes 10 times. Sometimes enough that he wondered whether he was becoming ridiculous. What if she became sick? What if he missed something important? What if he wasn't enough? He had read every parenting book he could buy. Downloaded 3 parenting apps. Filled notebooks with feeding schedules. Recorded every bottle, every nap, every diaper, every sneeze. And somehow, he still felt like he was improvising every single day. His gaze drifted toward his laptop on the dining table. The screen displayed an unfinished chapter. Word count, 42,317. Deadline, 3 weeks ago. His phone vibrated, as if summoned by guilt itself. Editor Kong. Minjae stared at the screen. At 6 in the morning. His editor was awake. Or perhaps he had never gone to sleep either. Minjae answered. Hello. A long silence. Then, are you alive? I think so. You think? I haven't confirmed. His editor sighed. I've received exactly 3 pages this month. I know. I've also received 14 photographs of your daughter. Those were accidental. They were very cute. They were definitely accidental. Another sigh. How's Haneul? Minjae looked down. She remained asleep against him. She's healthy. And you? Minjae. I'm functioning. Barely. Barely. His editor was quiet for a moment. You don't have to pretend with me. Minjae smiled tiredly. I know. I can postpone the deadline a little longer. I appreciate it. But you also need to finish eventually. I know. You've disappeared. Minjae glanced around the apartment. The overflowing laundry basket. The stack of unopened mail. The manuscript. The bottles. The diapers. His entire world now fit inside these walls. I know, he repeated softly. After ending the call, he remained seated for a long time. The apartment suddenly felt small. Too small. Not physically. Emotionally. There was nowhere to breathe. Nowhere to think. Nowhere to simply exist outside endless routines. His eyes wandered to an old framed photograph resting on a bookshelf. A much younger Minjae stood beside his grandmother in front of a small countryside house. Both of them were covered in dirt from gardening. His grandmother was laughing. He wasn't. He remembered complaining about mosquitoes the entire summer. She had laughed even harder. One day, she had told him, "You'll understand why people need quiet places." At the time, he hadn't understood. He preferred the city. Bright lights, bookstores, cafes, everything within walking distance. Now, he couldn't remember the last time he had noticed the weather. His grandmother's house, Hidam-ri. It had been empty for years after she passed away. The thought arrived quietly. So quietly that he almost missed it. What if? He looked down at Haneul. She slept peacefully against his heartbeat. What do you think? She didn't answer. Naturally. Still, for the first time in weeks, the future didn't feel like an endless hallway of sleepless nights. It looked like a little countryside house surrounded by trees. Maybe there, they could breathe. Minjae gently rested his cheek against the top of Haneul's head. I think. His tired voice was almost a whisper. We need a new beginning. Outside, the sun finally rose over Seoul. Inside the tiny apartment, a single father held his sleeping daughter and quietly made the first decision that would change both of their lives. Chapter 2, We're Moving, Haneul. The first thing Seo Minjae did after deciding to move was question whether sleep deprivation had permanently damaged his judgment. He stared at the old photograph on his bookshelf. His grandmother smiled warmly from the faded picture, dirt smudged across her cheeks after a day of gardening. Beside her stood a much younger Minjae with crossed arms, clearly complaining about something. He remembered that day. Mosquitoes. There had been mosquitoes everywhere. His grandmother had laughed until she cried. You'll miss this place one day, she had said. At 13, he had confidently declared that he would never leave Seoul again. I should apologize to Grandma. Haneul yawned from her baby bouncer. Minjae nodded solemnly. I know. You warned me. He looked around the apartment once more. The walls suddenly felt too close. The silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It was lonely. He wanted Haneul to grow somewhere she could breathe fresh air instead of traffic fumes. Somewhere with trees instead of concrete. Somewhere he could hear birds instead of sirens. Somewhere, maybe they could finally rest. He took a deep breath. Then picked up his phone. You're what? His editor, Kong Hunsu, sounded as though he had just swallowed an entire lemon. I'm moving. Where? The countryside. For a vacation. No. A writing retreat. No. Then why? Minjae bounced Haneul gently against his shoulder. I'm moving there. There was complete silence. Then, Minjae. Yes. You have a newborn. I know. You have an overdue manuscript. I know. You hate bugs. You hate dirt. You once screamed because a butterfly landed on your shoulder. It surprised me. Hunsu sighed. You've officially lost your mind. I probably did about 6 weeks ago. That earned a reluctant laugh. Is this really what you want? Minjae looked down at Haneul. She had fallen asleep while he was talking. His expression softened. I don't know if it's what I want. He gently brushed her tiny fingers. But I think it's what she needs. Another pause. Then Hunsu spoke more quietly. What about the novel? I'll finish it. You promise. I promise. You've broken 3 promises already. I'll make this one count. Hunsu laughed again. Fine. But if you come back after 2 weeks because a chicken chased you, I reserve the right to laugh. I don't think chickens are that aggressive. You've never met countryside chickens. 3 days later, Minjae unlocked the front door of his late grandmother's house for the first time in years. The wooden door creaked loudly. A cool breeze drifted through the entrance. Dust floated lazily through the sunlight. The house smelled like old wood. Books. Soap. Time. For a long moment, Minjae simply stood there. It felt smaller than he remembered, but warmer. The living room still held the old wooden shelves his grandfather had built decades ago. The faded curtains remained hanging beside the windows. Even the tiny clock above the kitchen entrance still worked. Tick, 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 as though it had patiently waited for someone to come home. Minjae carried Haneul inside. Welcome. His voice echoed softly. This is great-grandma's house. Haneul blinked at the ceiling. Clearly impressed. Or hungry. Possibly both. The next several hours were spent making a list. Check mark repair leaking faucet. Check mark clean every room. Check mark buy groceries. Check mark replace old curtains. Check mark find where grandma hid the extra blankets. Check mark remove spider. Minjae stared at the final item. The spider stared back. Neither moved. After nearly 30 seconds, Minjae slowly backed away. We can both live here. The spider remained unconvinced. So long as we respect each other's boundaries. Still nothing. Minjae nodded. I'll let you think about it. He closed the door. That room officially belonged to the spider now. Back in Seoul, packing became another adventure. Or disaster. Possibly both. Minjae believed he packed logically. His apartment disagreed. One box contained only diapers. Another contained bottles. Another contained sterilizing equipment. Another contained blankets. Another contained baby clothes. Another contained emergency medicine. Another contained toys Haneul wouldn't be old enough to use for several months. His own belongings consisted of 1 suitcase, his laptop, 3 notebooks, a box of pens, 6 sweaters, and exactly 2 frying pans. He frowned. I feel like I forgot something. Haneul hiccuped. My clothes. She blinked. No. He looked around. Food. Silence. Me. Still silence. Minjae sighed dramatically. I think becoming a father has rearranged my priorities. His phone buzzed. Reminder. Pack toothbrush. He stared at the notification. Right. Moving day arrived far sooner than expected. Professional movers carefully loaded furniture into a truck. Meanwhile, Minjae stood beside Haneul's stroller checking the diaper bag. Again. And once more. Formula. Check. Bottles. Check. Extra clothes. Check. Blanket. Check. Pacifier. Check. Baby wipes. Check. Medicine. Check. Emergency medicine. Check. Emergency medicine. Do babies really need this much stuff? One of the movers smiled. My wife says babies travel with more luggage than adults. I believe her. Another mover carried out a box. What should we label this one? Minjae looked. Baby towels. And this. Baby blankets. And this. Different baby blankets. And this. Winter baby blankets. The mover nodded respectfully. He had no further questions. By noon, the apartment stood nearly empty. The silence felt strange. Minjae slowly walked through each room one last time. This had once been enough. The quiet, the books, the late-night writing, his entire world had fit comfortably inside these walls. Not anymore. He returned to the living room where Haneul waited in her car seat. She was awake now. Big dark eyes watched him curiously. He crouched beside her. Ready. She stretched one tiny arm. I'll take that as a yes. He carefully adjusted her blanket. Checked the harness. Checked it again. Then gently touched her cheek. We're moving, Haneul. You probably won't remember any of this. But one day. He smiled softly. I hope this becomes the place you think of when someone says the word, home. Haneul answered with a tiny yawn. Minjae laughed quietly. I'll take that as another yes. The drive out of Seoul felt strangely emotional. Tall buildings slowly disappeared behind them. Traffic became lighter. Concrete gave way to hills. Apartment towers became forests. Roadside cafes became rice fields. The sky somehow looked bigger. Haneul slept through most of the journey. Whenever she stirred, Minjae immediately checked the rearview mirror. Still sleeping. Still breathing. Still peaceful. He smiled to himself. Hours later, a familiar wooden sign appeared beside the road. Welcome to Hidam-ri. Minjae slowed the car. The village looked almost exactly as he remembered. Small houses. Flower gardens. Children riding bicycles. An elderly man waving from his tractor. Everything moved more slowly here. The air drifting through the open window smelled of grass after summer rain. Without realizing it, Minjae rolled the window down farther. He inhaled deeply. Fresh air. Real silence. No horns. No sirens. No apartment walls separating strangers. Only birdsong and the rustling of leaves. He glanced toward the back seat. Haneul was beginning to wake. She blinked sleepily before looking out the window. Minjae smiled. Look, Haneul. This is where our new story begins. The little car continued down the quiet country road, carrying an exhausted father and his 6-week-old daughter toward the home that would quietly change both of their lives. Chapter 3, Welcome to Hidam-ri. The first thing Seo Minjae learned about countryside life was that silence didn't last very long. He had imagined peaceful mornings. Birds singing. Fresh air drifting through open windows. Maybe a cup of coffee while Haneul slept quietly nearby. Reality had other plans. Wah! Minjae opened one eye. The alarm clock read 5:42 a.m. He looked toward Haneul's portable crib. She kicked her tiny legs enthusiastically. Apparently, someone had decided the day should begin. Good morning. Haneul responded with another cheerful cry. You look suspiciously energetic. He, on the other hand, felt like he'd slept for approximately 6 minutes. Still, the room was brighter than their apartment in Seoul. Sunlight poured gently through the windows. Outside, birds chirped from somewhere in the garden. A cool breeze carried the scent of damp earth and flowers. For a brief moment, Minjae forgot how tired he was. This is nice. Then Haneul demanded breakfast. Right. After feeding her, Minjae carried Haneul around the house in a baby carrier strapped to his chest. I suppose we should introduce ourselves. The old house creaked softly as they walked. This is the kitchen. He opened a cupboard. Mostly empty. Another cupboard. Also empty. A third. Oh. He found a collection of old teacups neatly arranged inside. Great-grandma always loved tea. Haneul stared at them with complete seriousness. I know. They're fascinating. Next came the living room. Grandmother's wooden rocking chair still sat beside the window. A bookshelf filled with worn novels lined one wall. An old radio rested on a cabinet. It still works. Minjae pressed the switch. Static. Then gentle classical music filled the room. He smiled. Not bad. Haneul blinked. I suppose you're more of a lullaby person. By 8 o'clock, reality arrived. Dust. There was dust everywhere. Minjae tied a towel around his head dramatically. He looked like someone preparing for battle. Haneul. She lay happily on a blanket nearby, watching him wave a feather duster. If anything happens to me. She yawned. Please remember me kindly. She sneezed. I'll assume that means yes. Cleaning while caring for a newborn proved significantly more difficult than expected. Every 5 minutes, Haneul. He stopped sweeping, checked on her. She was fine. Returned to cleaning. 3 minutes later. HNGH. He checked again. Still fine. Another 4 minutes. Tiny hiccup. Minjae abandoned the broom once more. By lunchtime, one room was clean. Only the rest of the house remained. He collapsed onto the floor. I underestimated dust. Haneul looked delighted by his suffering. The garden wasn't much better. The grass reached almost to Minjae's knees. Wildflowers grew wherever they pleased. Bushes had become tiny forests. A vine had claimed one corner of the fence. We'll deal with that later. Something buzzed near his ear. A bee. Minjae froze. The bee ignored him completely. Still, he waited until it flew away before moving again. I wasn't scared. Haneul made a tiny cooing sound. I was being cautious. Shortly after noon, someone knocked on the front gate. Knock, knock, knock. Minjae blinked. He wasn't expecting visitors. Balancing Haneul against one shoulder, he walked outside. Standing beyond the gate was an elderly woman carrying 2 large containers. She smiled brightly. You must be Minjae. Before he could answer, she continued. I'm Obakya. I live across the road. I've been waiting all morning. Minjae barely had time to bow politely. Ah, hello. Bakya leaned forward. And this must be little Haneul. She gasped dramatically. Oh my, she's beautiful. Minjae smiled awkwardly. Thank you. Without another word, Bakya marched through the gate as though she'd lived there her entire life. Minjae stared. Please come in. I already did. She laughed. Within 5 minutes, Bakya had placed homemade side dishes in Minjae's refrigerator. Within 10 minutes, she had learned his age. His occupation. Haneul's age. Where he went to university. His favorite foods. How many novels he had written. Whether he could cook. The answer to the final question was disappointing. A little. Bakya narrowed her eyes. That means no. I can make instant noodles. She looked horrified. That doesn't count. I can fry eggs. We'll work on that. Minjae had the uncomfortable feeling this wasn't a suggestion. Bakya gently leaned over Haneul. The baby blinked sleepily. Oh, what a good girl. Haneul stretched one tiny hand toward her. Bakya's entire face melted. Oh, she likes me. Minjae laughed. She seems to. I'll bring porridge tomorrow. For Haneul. For you. You look thinner than a scarecrow. No arguments. She pointed toward him. A father who doesn't eat can't chase a toddler. Minjae looked down at tiny Haneul. She's 6 weeks old. They grow. Quickly. Fair point. As Bakya prepared to leave, she paused at the doorway. If you ever need help. She smiled kindly. Just ask. Minjae hesitated. He wasn't used to relying on people. I'll be alright. Bakya looked at him for a long moment. Then she smiled. Knowingly. Of course. She left. Minjae watched her disappear across the road. He had intended to establish clear boundaries with the neighbors. Instead, one of them had reorganized his refrigerator. Later that afternoon, Minjae decided to take Haneul for their first walk around the village. The stroller rolled smoothly along the quiet road. Children waved enthusiastically. Several elderly villagers greeted him before introducing themselves. A man repairing a bicycle offered directions to the nearest supermarket. Someone else pointed out the local clinic. Another recommended a bakery. Everyone seemed to know his name. Minjae hadn't told most of them. How? An elderly grandfather chuckled. In a village this small, news travels faster than the internet. Minjae suddenly understood. There were no secrets in Hidam-ri. The walk tired Haneul pleasantly. By the time they returned home, she had fallen asleep. Minjae quietly carried her inside. He placed her carefully into her crib. This time, she stayed asleep. He stared for nearly 10 seconds. Victory. He raised both fists silently. Then immediately remembered celebrations should probably remain quiet. Evening arrived gently. The orange glow of sunset painted the garden outside. Minjae stepped onto the wooden porch carrying a mug of coffee. He sat carefully in the old rocking chair. Inside, Haneul slept peacefully. Outside, the countryside settled into its evening rhythm. Crickets chirped. Leaves rustled softly in the breeze. Somewhere nearby, someone laughed. Far away, a dog barked once. Then silence returned. Real silence. Not empty. Comfortable. He closed his eyes. The cool wind brushed against his face. For the first time in many weeks. His shoulders relaxed. He realized he wasn't listening for traffic anymore. There wasn't any. He wasn't waiting for noisy neighbors. There weren't any. Only the sounds of a village preparing for night. A tiny cry drifted from inside the house. Minjae smiled. There you are. He stood, set down his untouched coffee, and walked back inside without the slightest hesitation. The coffee could wait. His daughter couldn't. As he gently lifted Haneul into his arms, she immediately stopped fussing. She blinked up at him with sleepy eyes. Minjae smiled warmly. I know. I'm here. Outside, the lights of Hidamri slowly flickered on one by one. Inside the little countryside house, an exhausted father held his daughter close. The house still needed cleaning. The garden still needed work. The future remained uncertain, but for the first time since leaving Seoul, the little house didn't feel empty anymore. It felt lived in. It felt hopeful. It was slowly, quietly becoming home. Chapter 4, The Man in My Yard. The peaceful atmosphere of Hidamri lasted exactly 3 days. On the 4th morning, Seo Minjae discovered a stranger walking through his yard. Excuse me. The man didn't immediately respond. Instead, he crouched beside the old wooden fence separating the property from the neighboring field, studying one of the broken fence posts with a thoughtful expression. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a faded gray t-shirt, worn jeans, and muddy work boots. A pair of work gloves hung from his back pocket. His black hair was slightly messy from the morning breeze. From where Minjae stood, the stranger looked completely at ease, which only made the situation stranger. Minjae tightened his grip on the baby monitor in one hand. He had only stepped outside to throw away a bag of trash while Haneul napped inside. The monitor sat securely in his palm. Its screen clearly showed his daughter sleeping peacefully in her crib. Still, why was someone in his yard? He cleared his throat. Ahem. The man looked up. Oh. His voice was calm. You must be the new owner. Minjae blinked. And you must be the man standing in my yard. The stranger glanced around as if noticing his surroundings for the first time. I suppose I am. Would you like to explain why? Instead of looking embarrassed, the man simply stood up and brushed dirt from his hands. The fence is broken. Minjae looked at the fence. It was, in fact, broken. I can see that. I came to check how bad it was. You came into my yard to check my fence. The fence belongs to both properties. Minjae frowned. Without asking, the stranger paused, then nodded once. Fair point. The apology sounded sincere. Unfortunately, it arrived after he had already wandered into someone else's yard. My name is Kong Taewon. He offered a polite nod. I live next door. Minjae looked toward the neighboring property. Hidden behind rows of fruit trees stood another house. He hadn't noticed it before. I'm Seo Minjae. I know. You know. The entire village knows. Minjae sighed quietly. Of course they did. Taewon walked closer to the damaged fence. The storm last month loosened these posts. He pressed one gently. The entire section leaned alarmingly. If this falls completely, children, or animals, could wander through. Minjae crouched beside him. The wood was old. One post had nearly rotted through. I hadn't looked this closely. You've been busy. Taewon's gaze briefly shifted toward the baby monitor in Minjae's hand. The baby. Sleeping. Taewon nodded once. Good. For several moments, neither spoke. Only birds filled the silence. Minjae eventually stood. I appreciate you telling me. Taewon scratched the back of his neck. I was actually planning to repair it today. Without asking, I was. Minjae stared. You usually repair strangers' fences. If they're dangerous, you don't think that's a little unusual? Taewon considered the question seriously. No. Minjae looked toward the sky. Maybe his editor had been right. Country people really were different. Before Minjae could continue the conversation, the baby monitor crackled. Then, wah! Haneul's cry echoed through the tiny speaker. Minjae's expression immediately changed. Haneul. He instinctively turned toward the house. Taewon looked at the monitor. Your daughter? Yes. She's inside. Of course. Taewon's brows pulled together. Alone. Minjae frowned. I'm standing right here, outside, for less than a minute. Taewon glanced toward the house again. The baby's crying. I heard. You should go. I know. So why are we still talking? Minjae blinked. Because you were the one talking. For the first time since meeting, Taewon's calm expression cracked slightly. He looked genuinely confused. Then, Haneul cried louder. Minjae immediately headed toward the front door. Taewon followed. Minjae stopped halfway. Why are you coming? In case something's wrong. I appreciate the concern. You don't sound appreciative. I'm trying. Inside the house, Haneul's cries filled the living room. Minjae quickly washed his hands before lifting her carefully from the crib. It's okay. I'm here. Haneul continued crying. He gently rocked her, checked her diaper. Still clean. Touched her forehead. Normal. Hungry already. He prepared a bottle. She refused it. Taewon stood quietly near the entrance. He didn't say anything. He simply watched. Minjae felt strangely self-conscious. What? You look tired. I have a 6-week-old baby. Fair. Minjae sighed. I've tried everything. He gently bounced Haneul against his shoulder. She was sleeping 5 minutes ago. Taewon watched the tiny infant carefully. Then asked, may I ask something? What? When did you last sleep? Minjae opened his mouth, closed it, thought carefully. Yesterday. Taewon waited. Morning. Another pause. Maybe. Taewon looked unconvinced. Haneul's cries became louder. Minjae continued walking slowly around the room. It's okay. It's okay. You don't have to tell yourself to. Minjae glanced toward Taewon. I wasn't. You were. I was encouraging her. Minjae narrowed his eyes. You're surprisingly annoying. I've been told that. You don't deny it. No. That somehow makes it worse. For the first time, the corner of Taewon's mouth lifted slightly. It wasn't quite a smile. But it was close. Haneul suddenly hiccuped. Then cried even harder. Minjae looked ready to panic. I don't understand. She was fine. I checked everything. I didn't do anything differently. Taewon quietly stepped closer. May I? Minjae blinked. May you what? Hold her. No. The answer came immediately. Taewon nodded. I expected that. Minjae hugged Haneul a little closer. I don't hand my daughter to strangers. Reasonable. I'm glad you think so. But, Taewon looked at Haneul with gentle concern. I am not worried about me. I'm worried about you. Minjae stared at him. For just a moment, he didn't know how to respond. Because beneath Taewon's blunt words wasn't criticism. It sounded like concern. Before either of them could say anything else, Haneul's crying slowly began to soften as Minjae continued rocking her. A tiny yawn escaped her. Then another. Finally, she settled against his shoulder. The room became quiet once more. Minjae let out a long breath. There, I told you. Taewon smiled faintly. You did. Neither man noticed how much the tension between them had eased. Not yet, but neither realized that this awkward, frustrating morning was only the beginning of a misunderstanding that would slowly change both of their lives. As Taewon stepped toward the door, he glanced back one last time. I'll come back tomorrow. Minjae frowned. Why? To repair the fence. I didn't agree. You didn't refuse. I'll bring tools. Before Minjae could protest again, Taewon walked out of the house. The front gate clicked shut. Silence returned. Minjae looked down at the peacefully sleeping Haneul. Then toward the window where Taewon's figure disappeared down the road. What a strange man. Haneul made a sleepy little sound against his shoulder. Minjae smiled. I know. I have a feeling he's going to be trouble. Outside, the morning breeze rustled through the orchard next door. Neither neighbor had made a good first impression. Neither imagined how often their paths would cross from this day forward. Chapter 5, Give Me My Baby Back. The following morning began with rain. Not heavy rain, just a steady drizzle that covered Hidamri in a cool gray mist. Seo Minjae stood in the kitchen, gently bouncing Haneul in one arm while trying to pour coffee with the other. The coffee missed the mug. Close enough. Haneul stared at him. I know. I saw it too. He cleaned the spill with a sigh. Please don't learn your housekeeping skills from me. A tiny hiccup escaped Haneul. Minjae smiled. I'll pretend that was encouragement. For the first time since arriving in Hidamri, the little house actually felt lived in. The boxes were mostly unpacked. The living room looked brighter after cleaning. Fresh side dishes from grandmother Obakya filled one shelf of the refrigerator. The old clock ticked peacefully above the kitchen doorway. It wasn't perfect, but it was beginning to feel like home. Then, knock, knock, knock. 3 firm knocks echoed from the front door. Minjae frowned. It can't be Grandma Bakya. She never knocked. She simply walked in. Balancing Haneul against his shoulder, he opened the door. Standing outside, wearing a rain jacket and carrying a toolbox, was Kong. Taewon. Morning. You actually came. I said I would. Minjae sighed. You really weren't joking about the fence. Taewon looked mildly confused. Why would I joke about a fence? Fair enough. Without another word, Taewon walked toward the broken fence. Minjae watched him from the porch. The man worked with quiet efficiency. Within minutes he had removed the damaged wooden post and was measuring a replacement. Minjae had to admit, he knew exactly what he was doing. Still, that didn't mean Minjae had forgiven him for entering the yard without permission. Inside the house, Haneul began rubbing her eyes. Nap time. Let's get you settled. Minjae carried her to the bedroom and carefully laid her in the crib. He gently rubbed her tiny back. It's okay. I'm just outside. Within a few minutes, her breathing slowed. As always, Minjae waited another minute before leaving. Then another. Only after convincing himself she was truly asleep did he quietly step outside. The baby monitor remained clipped to his pocket. Outside, Taewon tightened another bolt. Almost done. Minjae nodded. You're fast. I've repaired this fence before. You have. Your grandmother kept feeding the neighborhood goats. What? They escaped. Repeatedly. Minjae blinked. Somehow. That sounded exactly like something his grandmother would do. He couldn't help laughing. Taewon glanced at him briefly. It wasn't funny for the fence. It is now. For the first time, both men almost smiled at the same time. Almost. Then, wah! The sharp cry burst from the baby monitor. Minjae immediately straightened. Haneul. He hurried toward the house. Taewon followed instinctively. Minjae barely noticed. His entire attention focused on his daughter. Haneul's cries filled the bedroom. Minjae scooped her into his arms immediately. It's okay. Pop is here. She continued crying. He checked her diaper. Dry. He checked her temperature. Normal. He offered a bottle. She refused. He gently rocked her. Still crying. Minjae frowned. What is it? You were sleeping so well. Behind him, Taewon quietly watched. He hesitated before speaking. Has she been like this long? Only since she woke up. Does she usually cry this hard? Sometimes. Minjae continued pacing. His movements were practiced, gentle, patient, but there was unmistakable worry behind every glance toward Haneul. Taewon noticed. After several more minutes, Haneul cried even harder. Minjae whispered softly. I know. I'm trying. Taewon took one cautious step forward. Minjae. What? May I try holding her? The room became completely silent. Minjae turned slowly. No. The answer was immediate. Firm. Protective. Taewon nodded. I understand. I don't think you do. Minjae hugged Haneul a little closer. You've met her twice. I know. I don't hand my daughter to someone I barely know. I wasn't offended. You should be. I'm not. That somehow irritated Minjae even more. Haneul continued crying. Louder. Her tiny face turned bright red. Minjae's own expression slowly shifted from frustration to helplessness. I've checked everything. I don't understand. Taewon remained quiet for a long moment. Then he spoke carefully. You're exhausted. I'm fine. No, I'm fine. You almost poured coffee onto the counter this morning. You've yawned every 3 minutes. You haven't sat down once. Minjae opened his mouth, closed it again. That's unrelated. Taewon didn't argue. Instead, he spoke gently. I wasn't saying you're a bad father. I know. I was saying you're tired. Minjae looked away. He hated how accurate that sounded. Haneul suddenly squirmed. Minjae instinctively adjusted his hold. For one brief moment, his tired hand slipped. Not enough for danger. Not even close. But enough to frighten him. His heart lurched. Oh. He immediately held her securely again. His breathing quickened. Taewon noticed. Without thinking, he stepped closer. Careful. I know. The words came out sharper than Minjae intended. Silence followed. Rain tapped softly against the windows. Haneul cried. Minjae lowered his head. Sorry. Taewon simply nodded. You don't have to apologize. I snapped. You were scared. Minjae didn't answer. Because Taewon was right. He wasn't angry. He was terrified. Several more minutes passed. Haneul still wouldn't settle. Finally, Minjae slowly looked toward Taewon. He hesitated. If I let you. Taewon waited quietly. You'll give her back immediately. Of course. You'll support her head. I know. You won't walk around. I won't. You'll hand her back if she cries more. I will. Minjae took a deep breath. Everything inside him resisted. Every protective instinct screamed not to do it. But another part of him whispered something different. You can't carry everything alone forever. Very carefully, he placed Haneul into Taewon's waiting arms. For a second, nothing happened. Taewon adjusted his hold naturally, supporting her tiny head and gently resting one hand against her back. His movements were calm, confident, not showy, simply careful. Haneul blinked. Her cries softened. Minjae stared. Taewon looked equally surprised. Then, Haneul stopped crying completely. The room fell silent. Minjae blinked once, twice. His daughter looked perfectly content. She even gave a tiny sigh before curling one little hand against Taewon's shirt. Taewon looked down at her. Hello. Haneul blinked sleepily. Minjae remained frozen. Finally, he managed to speak. Give me my baby back. Taewon looked up. She's comfortable. I can see that. You just asked me to hold her. I've changed my mind. A tiny smile tugged at the corner of Taewon's mouth. You're jealous. I am not jealous of my own daughter. You sound jealous. I sound like her father. Taewon carefully handed Haneul back. The moment she returned to Minjae's arms, she remained calm. Minjae looked at her suspiciously. You embarrassed me. Haneul responded by yawning. Taewon picked up his toolbox. The fence is finished. Minjae nodded absent-mindedly. Thank you. It was the first genuine thank you he had given the man. Taewon smiled faintly. You're welcome. He started walking toward the gate. Before leaving, he glanced back once. You're doing better than you think. Minjae looked surprised. What? You worry about everything. Parents who don't care don't worry that much. Without waiting for an answer, Taewon walked away through the gentle rain. Minjae stood quietly beneath the porch roof, holding Haneul close. His eyes drifted toward the repaired fence. Then toward the road where Taewon disappeared. He still found the man irritating. Blunt. Annoyingly calm. Far too willing to involve himself in other people's lives. But, for the first time, Minjae couldn't honestly say he disliked him. He looked down at Haneul. So, you like him already? Haneul smiled in her sleep. Minjae groaned dramatically. Traitor. The rain continued to fall softly over Hidam-ri. Beyond the newly repaired fence, two neighbors had taken the smallest step toward understanding each other. Neither of them realized it yet. But this would become the first of many ordinary mornings they would eventually share. Chapter 6, The Village Has Already Heard. Seo Minjae learned his second important lesson about Hidam-ri the very next morning. Nothing remained a secret, not even for 24 hours. Good morning, Haneul. The little girl blinked sleepily from her high chair while Minjae carefully prepared her morning bottle. Outside, the rain from yesterday had disappeared. Warm sunlight streamed through the kitchen window. Birds chirped cheerfully. The repaired fence stood proudly in the garden. Minjae glanced at it. He did good work. Haneul made a happy little sound. I know. I already thanked him. She smiled. Don't look so pleased. After feeding her, Minjae checked the refrigerator. Almost empty. He sighed. Looks like we need groceries. The nearest supermarket was too far for a quick trip, but Bakya had mentioned a small village shop within walking distance. Perfect. Minjae packed Haneul's diaper bag with practiced efficiency. Extra diaper. Extra clothes. Bottle. Formula. Blanket. Wipes. Pacifier. Tiny stuffed rabbit. He checked everything twice. Then once more. You'd think we were preparing for an expedition. Haneul yawned. I agree. The village road was peaceful that morning. The stroller rolled smoothly beneath rows of tall trees. Several villagers greeted him with cheerful smiles. Morning, Minjae. How's little Haneul? She's getting bigger already. Minjae smiled politely each time. Good morning. He still found it slightly unsettling that everyone knew both their names. The village shop stood at the corner of a small intersection. A wooden sign hung above the entrance. Inside, shelves were filled with fresh vegetables, rice, snacks, and household supplies. A bell jingled as he entered. Immediately, every conversation stopped. Minjae froze. Good morning. Three elderly women looked at him. Then at Haneul. Then back at him. One of them gasped dramatically. Oh, he's the novelist. Another whispered loudly. The one who fought Taewon. Minjae blinked. Excuse me. Within seconds, he found himself surrounded. The shop owner smiled warmly. So you're finally here. Minjae bowed politely. Hello. An elderly grandfather chuckled. I heard you nearly punched Kong Taewon. What? Another woman shook her head. No, no. I heard Taewon climbed your fence. A third disagreed. I heard someone threatened someone else with a shovel. A shovel? Minjae looked genuinely horrified. There wasn't any shovel. The three elders exchanged thoughtful looks. So there wasn't. There wasn't. The shop became unusually quiet. One elderly woman nodded seriously. I'll tell everyone. Please do. She smiled kindly. They'll probably believe me. Minjae wasn't completely convinced. As he pushed the stroller toward the vegetables, another familiar voice called out. Morning. Minjae turned. Standing near a basket of apples was Kong Taewon. Of course. He wore a light blue work shirt today with the sleeves rolled to his elbows. A small basket rested in one hand. He looked as calm as ever. Minjae sighed. Good morning. Taewon looked around the unusually silent shop. Why is everyone staring? One elderly man answered immediately. They're trying to figure out who won. Won what? The fight. Taewon blinked. What fight? The one between you two. Both men looked at each other. Then back at the villagers. Minjae rubbed his forehead. There wasn't a fight. Taewon nodded. We argued. A misunderstanding. Nobody punched anyone. No shovels. The elderly woman from earlier looked disappointed. Oh. The shop suddenly burst into laughter. Even Minjae couldn't help smiling. One grandfather scratched his head. I suppose the story became bigger. A little bigger, Minjae replied. Bokja's familiar voice echoed from the entrance. I told all of you not to exaggerate. She marched inside carrying an empty shopping basket. Then spotted Minjae. Oh, there you are. She walked straight toward Haneul. My little angel. Haneul kicked her tiny feet happily. Bokja beamed. She remembers me. Minjae smiled. I think she remembers your voice. I'll accept that. Bokja noticed Taewon nearby. You. Taewon looked up. Yes, Grandma. Stop frightening my new neighbor. Taewon looked genuinely confused. I repaired his fence. You walked into his yard first. Fair. Bokja nodded proudly. See. He admits it. Minjae covered his mouth to hide a laugh. Taewon glanced at him. You're enjoying this. A little. It was the first time Minjae had seen Taewon lose an argument. He found it surprisingly entertaining. As everyone resumed shopping, Bokja quietly walked beside Minjae. How are you settling in? Better. You eating properly? Mostly. She narrowed her eyes. Mostly. I haven't lived entirely on instant noodles. Good. I've also cooked eggs. Excellent. Twice. We're making progress. Minjae laughed. He hadn't expected village life to feel this warm. Everyone asked questions. Everyone seemed interested. It was slightly overwhelming, yet none of it felt malicious. Meanwhile, Taewon stood near the fruit display talking with the shop owner. Minjae overheard pieces of the conversation. Finished repairing the Kim family's roof yesterday. And Mrs. Choi's water pump working again. What about the school fence? Tomorrow. Minjae looked over. The shop owner noticed. Kong Taewon fixes everything. He never says no. Taewon shrugged. If I can help, I help. Minjae silently watched him. So, he wasn't unusually nosy. He was simply like this with everyone. That explained a lot. On the walk home, Bokja accompanied Minjae for part of the way. She pushed the stroller while Minjae carried the grocery bags. You know. She smiled knowingly. Taewon's a good boy. Minjae nearly tripped. Good boy. He's 31. Exactly. She laughed. He grew up here. Always helping people. Always pretending he doesn't enjoy it. Minjae glanced toward the orchard in the distance. He's certainly persistent. Bokja grinned. So are you. What? Neither of you likes admitting when you're wrong. Minjae opened his mouth, then closed it. That's unfair. It is. She smiled. Because it's true. Back home, Minjae unpacked the groceries while Haneul watched from her baby seat. Fresh vegetables, rice, fruit, milk, bread, much healthier than his usual shopping habits. He placed a bag of apples into a basket. One rolled across the table. Haneul stared at it with absolute concentration. Minjae laughed. You can't eat apples yet. She continued staring. Nice try. As evening settled over the little house, Minjae opened his laptop for the first time that day. The blinking cursor waited patiently. He typed a single sentence. Then another. Words came slowly. But they came. After nearly an hour, he leaned back with a tired smile. It wasn't much. Only a few pages. Still, it was progress. From the bedroom came a tiny cry. Minjae stood immediately. His writing could wait. As he lifted Haneul into his arms, she quieted almost instantly. He smiled softly. I know. You always come first. Outside, somewhere beyond the repaired fence, Taewon finished another day's work in the orchard. Neither neighbor realized it yet, but the awkward misunderstanding that had introduced them was already becoming one of Hidamri's favorite stories. And slowly, very slowly, it was turning into something they would one day laugh about together. Chapter 7, The Crib Incident. The following morning began with confidence. That should have been Minjae's first warning. Seo Minjae looked proudly at the large cardboard box sitting in the middle of his living room. Printed across the front were the words, "Premium wooden baby crib." He smiled. Today's the day. Haneul, lying comfortably on a blanket nearby, stared at the box with great interest. I know. You've been using the portable crib long enough. He crouched beside her. Papa bought you a proper one. She stretched both tiny arms into the air. I'll take that as approval. The delivery had arrived early that morning. The crib was sturdier, larger, and would last for years. Minjae had deliberately chosen one that could grow with Haneul. It had also come with an instruction manual, nearly 50 pages long. He frowned. Why does a crib need a novel? As a novelist, he found this mildly offensive. Minjae opened the box. Wooden panels, screws, bolts, brackets, tiny bags labeled with letters. Another smaller bag labeled extra parts. He blinked. Why are there extra parts? Surely, every part should be necessary. He picked up the instruction booklet. Estimated assembly time, 45 minutes. Minjae smiled confidently. I've written 6 novels. I have a university degree. I can absolutely build a crib. Haneul made a tiny coo. Thank you for believing in me. 45 minutes later, the living room looked as though a furniture factory had exploded. Wooden panels leaned against chairs. Screws rolled beneath the sofa. The instruction manual lay open on page 27. Minjae sat cross-legged on the floor, staring at what was unmistakably not a crib. It resembled modern art. Something's wrong. Haneul watched him from her baby seat. She seemed entertained. Minjae picked up the manual again. Step 1. Completed. Step 2. Completed. Step 3. Wait. He flipped backward. I attached panel C where panel B should be. He sighed. Fine. He carefully unscrewed everything. 20 minutes later, he had somehow made it worse. One side stood taller than the other. The mattress support leaned sideways. There were still 7 screws left over. Why? He counted again. Still 7. The manual insisted there should be none. Haneul let out a happy squeal. Minjae looked at her dramatically. You're laughing at me. She blinked. I know babies can't laugh properly yet. But somehow I feel judged. Just as he reached for the screwdriver again. Knock, knock, knock. Minjae looked toward the door. He already knew. Only one person knocked exactly 3 times. He opened it. Kong Taewon stood outside carrying a basket filled with fresh peaches. Morning, morning. Taewon noticed the exhausted look on Minjae's face. Then his eyes drifted past him. Into the living room. Silence. Is that supposed to be a crib? Minjae looked offended. It will be. Stop making that sound. What sound? The one that says you don't believe me. I didn't say anything. Exactly. Taewon stepped inside after Minjae awkwardly invited him in. He placed the peaches on the kitchen counter. From our orchard. You didn't have to. We had too many. Minjae smiled politely. Thank you. Taewon nodded once before turning toward the disaster in the living room. He slowly walked around the half-built crib. Studied it from one side. Then the other. Finally, he crouched beside it. Interesting. Minjae crossed his arms. What's interesting? I've never seen someone assemble a crib upside down. Upside down. Taewon pointed calmly. The mattress support belongs underneath. Minjae stared. Oh. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then Minjae quietly covered his face with both hands. I spent an hour doing that. Taewon tried very hard not to smile. He failed. A quiet chuckle escaped him. Minjae peeked through his fingers. Are you laughing? A little. You are. I am. I dislike you. I know. Taewon rolled up his sleeves. May I? Minjae looked suspicious. Do what? Help. I can do it. Taewon glanced at the crooked frame. Don't. Me. I'm only observing. You look very judgmental. I look practical. Minjae sighed dramatically. Fine. But only because Haneul deserves a functional crib. Not because you need help. Exactly. Taewon wisely chose not to argue. The two men knelt on opposite sides of the crib. Hold that panel. This one. The other one. There are 4. The longer one. They're all long. Taewon blinked. Fair point. Minjae couldn't help laughing. For the first time since meeting, they worked together without arguing. Well, mostly. Wrong screw. They're identical. One's 2 millimeters longer. You can tell. Yes. You're terrifying. Meanwhile, Haneul watched the entire operation with wide eyes. Occasionally she made cheerful little noises. Taewon looked over. I think she's supervising. Minjae smiled. She's making sure we don't mess it up. I thought you said you could build it. I've changed my position. An hour later, the crib stood proudly in the middle of the room. Straight, level, solid. Minjae carefully pushed one side. It didn't move. He pushed harder. Still nothing. Taewon noticed. Trying to break it. Testing it. There you go again. Minjae carefully placed the mattress inside. Then gently carried Haneul over. Moment of truth. He lowered her onto the soft mattress. For a second, she simply blinked, then stretched comfortably. Her tiny hands waved happily in the air. She looked around curiously. No crying, no fussing, just quiet curiosity. Minjae smiled so brightly that Taewon found himself smiling too. I think she likes it. I think so too. Minjae gently brushed Haneul's tiny hair away from her forehead. I'm glad. As Taewon gathered the remaining tools, he quietly picked up the 7 leftover screws. They're extras. Minjae blinked. Really? Yes. I spent 20 minutes counting them. I guessed. You could have told me. I wanted to see how long you'd keep counting. Minjae stared at him. You did that on purpose. Maybe. You smiled. Did I? You definitely smiled. It happens occasionally. They carried the empty cardboard box outside together. The afternoon breeze rustled through the trees. The repaired fence stood between their properties. Minjae looked toward it. Thanks. Taewon glanced over. For what? The crib. And, he hesitated. The fence. Taewon smiled faintly. You're welcome. For a moment, neither said anything. The silence wasn't awkward. It was comfortable. Unexpectedly comfortable. Inside the house, Haneul let out a tiny happy squeal. Both men looked toward the window at exactly the same time. Then looked at each other. Minjae laughed quietly. I suppose our supervisor approves. Taewon nodded. I think she does. As Taewon walked back toward the orchard, Minjae watched him go. He still found the man annoyingly calm. Still far too willing to help. Still frustratingly difficult to argue with. But today, when he looked at the sturdy crib standing inside the house, he couldn't deny one simple truth. He was grateful. And for the first time since moving to Hideum-ri, Minjae wondered if perhaps having someone nearby wasn't such a bad thing after all. Chapter 8, The Grocery Trip Disaster. 2 weeks had passed since Seo Minjae and Haneul moved to Hideum-ri. The house was cleaner. The garden was slowly improving. His writing routine had returned, at least in small pieces. And Haneul. Haneul had discovered the joy of being awake for absolutely no reason at 3 in the morning. Minjae looked at her tiny face as she happily kicked her blanket. You're lucky you're cute. She rewarded him with a gummy smile. That's unfair. After breakfast, Minjae checked the pantry. Rice. Almost gone. Milk. Gone. Vegetables. Gone. Coffee. Emergency. Haneul blinked. Everything else can wait. But not coffee. He packed the diaper bag as usual. Then glanced outside. The sky was bright blue. Perfect weather. We'll take the stroller. The village shop was busier than usual. A delivery truck was parked outside. Several villagers chatted while carrying baskets of fresh produce. As soon as Minjae entered, the bell above the door jingled. Everyone looked up. One elderly grandfather smiled. The novelist's here. Another waved enthusiastically. And the little princess. Minjae laughed awkwardly. Good morning. Haneul looked around with wide, curious eyes. Everything fascinated her. The colorful snack packages. The hanging wind chimes near the entrance. Even the old refrigerator humming in the corner. Minjae pushed the stroller through the narrow aisles. Rice. He placed a bag into the basket beneath the stroller. Milk. Another carton. Eggs. Very carefully. He paused in front of the coffee shelf. His expression became unexpectedly serious. Instant coffee. Ground coffee. Dark roast. Medium roast. He folded his arms. This requires thought. Haneul made a tiny impatient sound. I know. It's an important life decision. While Minjae debated coffee, Haneul quietly wriggled one tiny sock loose. A few seconds later, it landed on the floor. Neither of them noticed. Oh, a familiar voice came from behind. Kong Taewon bent down and picked up the little white sock. He smiled faintly. I think someone dropped this. Minjae turned around. Morning. Taewon held up the sock. I don't think it'll fit me. Minjae accepted it with a laugh. Thank you. He carefully slipped it back onto Haneul's tiny foot. She kicked happily. Taewon looked down. She's getting bigger. I know. It feels like every week she changes. The shop owner suddenly called out from behind the counter. Taewon, can you help unload the flour? Of course. Without hesitation, Taewon rolled up his sleeves and headed outside. Minjae watched him go. The shop owner noticed. He always helps. Even when he's shopping. Especially then. Minjae smiled to himself. Some people simply couldn't ignore work. After paying for the groceries, Minjae discovered a new problem. He looked at the stroller. Then the shopping bags. Then the stroller again. He had bought far more than expected. 2 heavy grocery bags. A sack of rice. A sleepy baby. Only 2 hands. This, he sighed, may have been poor planning. Just as he considered making 2 trips. I'll carry those. Taewon had returned. Before Minjae could protest, 1 grocery bag disappeared from his hand. Then the sack of rice. Wait, you don't have 2. I know. You've helped enough. Taewon shrugged. We're walking the same way. We're not. Our houses are next to each other. That's annoyingly logical. They walked together along the quiet country road. For several minutes, only birds filled the silence. Then, Haneul sneezed. Both men immediately looked down. Bless you, Minjae whispered. Taewon nodded seriously. Very powerful sneeze. Minjae laughed. It really was. Haneul blinked proudly, as though accepting the compliment. Halfway home, they passed the village playground. Several children were chasing one another across the grass. One little boy stopped running when he noticed the stroller. He peeked inside. So tiny. His younger sister looked too. Is she real? Minjae smiled. Very real. The little girl waved. Hi, baby. Haneul stared at them with complete seriousness. Then, she smiled. The children gasped dramatically. She smiled. She likes us. They ran off to tell their friends. Within seconds, 4 more children appeared. Minjae blinked. Oh. Taewon quietly stepped beside him. They're harmless. I know. They've just never seen a baby this young. One little girl carefully offered Haneul a tiny yellow flower. For the baby. Minjae accepted it with a warm smile. Thank you. The girl beamed, then skipped away. Haneul stared at the flower with deep concentration. Minjae gently tucked it into the stroller beside her blanket. I think that's your first present from a friend. When they finally reached Minjae's house, Taewon carried the groceries into the kitchen. He placed everything neatly on the counter. There. Thank you. Minjae meant it. Taewon nodded. No problem. As he turned to leave, Haneul suddenly made a cheerful little sound. Both men looked at her. She stretched both tiny hands toward Taewon. The room fell silent. Taewon blinked. Me. Minjae looked down at his daughter. Excuse me. Haneul happily waved her tiny arms again. Taewon scratched his cheek awkwardly. I think she's greeting me. Minjae narrowed his eyes. You've become popular. I've done nothing. Exactly. That's suspicious. Taewon chuckled quietly. Before leaving, Taewon looked toward the garden. The tomatoes need watering. Minjae followed his gaze. I forgot. I noticed. I was busy. I know. I'll do it this evening. Taewon nodded once. Good. Then he walked home. Minjae stood on the porch holding Haneul. He looked toward the neighboring orchard where Taewon disappeared between the trees. He notices everything. Haneul made another happy sound. I know. I've noticed too. That evening, after watering the garden and putting Haneul to bed, Minjae finally opened his laptop. He wrote for nearly 2 hours without stopping. The countryside was quiet. The house was peaceful. His daughter slept soundly in her new crib. For the first time in months. The words flowed naturally. When he finally leaned back, he smiled at the finished pages. Maybe, just maybe, they were both beginning to settle into this new life. Outside, the lights in Taewon's house were still on. Two neighbors spent another ordinary evening only a fence apart. Neither realized that these small, everyday moments were quietly weaving their lives together. Chapter 9, Haneul's First Smile. 3 weeks after moving to Heedam-ri, Seo Minjae realized something strange. The house was no longer quiet. Not because of crying, because of laughter. Tiny, soft, unexpected laughter. Most of it came from one very small person. The morning sunlight spilled through the living room windows. Minjae lay on a thick blanket spread across the wooden floor while Haneul rested beside him on her tummy. She had recently discovered that lifting her head was a fascinating challenge. Come on, you can do it. Haneul made a determined little grunt. She pushed with both tiny arms. Her head lifted. For exactly 2 seconds. Then, plop, her face landed gently on the blanket. Minjae immediately applauded. Excellent. You almost conquered gravity. Haneul blinked. Then tried again. The third attempt lasted almost 4 seconds. Minjae grinned proudly. That's my girl. She looked at him with bright eyes. Then, a tiny sound escaped her. Hey, Minjae froze. Did you just laugh? Haneul kicked her little legs happily. Hey, this time there was no mistaking it. It wasn't a cry. It wasn't a hiccup. It was the beginning of a laugh. Minjae's eyes widened. No way. He leaned closer. Haneul. She looked straight at him. And smiled. A wide, gummy smile. Then another tiny laugh. Minjae sat completely still. His heart felt strangely light. He laughed too. There it is. Your first laugh. Without thinking, he grabbed his phone. Click. Another picture. Then another. He switched to video. Haneul. She waved both tiny arms. Papa's watching. She answered with another delighted little laugh. Minjae couldn't stop smiling. I have proof. No one can tell me this didn't happen. He immediately sent the video to his editor. Minjae, emergency. 5 seconds later. Editor Kong. What's wrong? Minjae, watch the video. A full minute passed. Then, Editor Kong. I almost called an ambulance. Editor Kong. She's adorable. Editor Kong. Don't scare me like that. Minjae chuckled. Worth it. Around noon, there was another familiar knock. 3 knocks. Exactly the same as always. Minjae smiled before opening the door. Morning. Taewon stood outside carrying a small wooden crate. Fresh tomatoes. Again. Our harvest was good. You keep giving me vegetables. You keep eating them. Fair. Taewon noticed Minjae's unusually cheerful expression. You look happy. I am. What happened? Minjae tried to look calm. He failed completely. Haneul laughed. Taewon blinked. Really? Come in. Inside, Haneul lay on her play mat surrounded by colorful toys. The moment she spotted Minjae approaching, she smiled. A huge smile. Minjae looked absurdly proud. See. Taewon crouched nearby. Hello. Haneul stared at him, then back at Minjae. Then, hey. A tiny laugh escaped again. Taewon's calm expression softened immediately. There it is. Minjae nodded enthusiastically. I've replayed it 17 times. Only 17. I didn't want to seem excessive. You've probably watched it more. 24. Taewon chuckled quietly. Minjae picked Haneul up. Who's the happiest baby in the village? Haneul reached toward his face. Her tiny fingers grabbed his nose. Ow. Taewon looked away. Should I help? No. This is between me and my daughter. Haneul pulled again. Minjae laughed helplessly. You're stronger than you look. Taewon quietly unpacked the tomatoes in the kitchen. You've written today. Minjae nodded. 3 pages. That's good. It doesn't sound like much. It is. Minjae looked thoughtful. Back in Seoul, I used to measure success by chapters. And now, he glanced toward Haneul. By naps. Taewon smiled. I think that's reasonable. That afternoon, Bakya arrived carrying homemade soup. As usual, she didn't wait to be invited inside. Oh, my little Haneul. She hurried over. Minjae laughed. Good afternoon to you too. I already greeted you last week. I suppose that's true. Bakya gently tickled Haneul's tiny foot. The baby giggled. Bakya gasped dramatically. She laughed. I know. She laughed at me. Minjae folded his arms. She laughed at me first. Bakya smiled knowingly. Someone's jealous. I am not competing with a grandmother. You absolutely are. Taewon quietly looked out the window to hide his smile. By late afternoon, the little house felt unusually lively. Bakya chatted while preparing side dishes. Taewon repaired a loose cabinet hinge without anyone asking. Minjae folded freshly washed baby clothes. Haneul watched everyone from her blanket. Occasionally smiling, occasionally laughing. Every time she did, the entire room unconsciously smiled with her. Minjae suddenly noticed it. 3 adults, 1 tiny baby, sharing an ordinary afternoon. It felt comfortable, natural. He hadn't expected that. As sunset painted the sky orange, Bakya finally headed home. So, she looked at Minjae. You're not lonely anymore. Minjae blinked. What? You smiled more today. She gently patted his shoulder. That's enough. Then she left. After dinner, Taewon prepared to leave as well. He paused at the front door. You know. Minjae looked up. I think Haneul laughs the most. When you're smiling. Minjae stared. What? You smile differently now. Taewon spoke simply. Less tired. More relaxed. Minjae didn't know what to say. Because he thought Taewon might be right. That night, after putting Haneul to bed, Minjae quietly stood beside her crib. She slept peacefully. One tiny hand rested against her cheek. He smiled without realizing it. Not the polite smile he wore around strangers. Not the tired smile he forced through difficult days. A real one. Gentle. Warm. Hopeful. He looked around the little house. The old wooden floor. The repaired cabinet. The tomatoes in the kitchen. The soup Bakya had brought. The soft evening breeze drifting through the open window. 3 weeks ago, this house had felt unfamiliar. Now, it was beginning to feel like a place filled with memories. Minjae looked down at his sleeping daughter. You know, he whispered softly. I think. Papa smiled today too. Outside, somewhere beyond the fence, the lights in Taewon's house slowly went out. Another ordinary day in Hidam-ri came to a peaceful end. It wasn't exciting. It wasn't dramatic. But it was exactly the kind of day Minjae had unknowingly been searching for. And for the first time in a long while, he was genuinely happy. Chapter 10, Haneul's First Fever. The peaceful rhythm of Hidam-ri was interrupted just before dawn. At first, Seo Minjae thought nothing of it. Haneul had been fussier than usual during the night. She woke every hour, cried softly, wanted to be held. It wasn't unusual. She was still so little. But something felt different. The sky outside was still dark when Minjae lifted her from the crib. It's okay. Papa's here. Usually, Haneul settled the moment she heard his voice. Today, she didn't. She rested weakly against his shoulder. Far quieter than normal. Minjae frowned. Haneul. He gently touched her forehead. His hand froze. You're warm. His heart immediately began pounding. He hurried to the kitchen drawer and grabbed the digital thermometer. Come on. A few long seconds later. 38.2 degrees Celsius. Minjae stared at the screen. No. He checked again. The result was the same. His stomach dropped. He took a slow breath. Okay. Don't panic. He whispered the words more for himself than for Haneul. He remembered everything the pediatrician had told him. Stay calm. Check for other symptoms. Keep her hydrated. Watch her closely. If the fever rises or she seems unusually sleepy, seek medical care. He carefully offered her a bottle. She drank only a little before turning away. Minjae's worry deepened. This isn't like you. He quickly packed the diaper bag. Extra clothes. Medicine booklet. Health records. Formula. Bottles. Blanket. Thermometer. His hands shook as he zipped the bag. He hated it. Every movement felt clumsy. He looked down at Haneul. Her tiny face looked tired. She let out a weak little whimper. It's okay. We're going to the clinic. Just as Minjae reached the front door, a familiar voice called from outside. Minjae. Kong Taewon stood near the repaired fence, carrying a basket of vegetables. The moment he saw Minjae's face, his expression changed. What happened? Haneul has a fever. Taewon immediately set the basket down. How high? 38.2. When did it start? I don't know. Just now. Minjae looked completely overwhelmed. I think we should go. Taewon nodded once. We should. Within minutes, they were in Taewon's pickup truck. Minjae sat in the passenger seat, Haneul cradled carefully against his chest. He couldn't stop checking her forehead. Every few seconds. Taewon noticed. She'll be okay. I know. But Minjae's voice trembled. I've never done this before. Taewon kept his eyes on the road. I know. Silence filled the truck. Only the soft hum of the engine remained. Finally, Taewon spoke again. You're not alone. Minjae looked at him. For a brief moment, the words eased the tightness in his chest. The village clinic was small but welcoming. A nurse immediately guided them inside. The pediatrician examined Haneul carefully. She listened to her breathing, checked her ears, looked at her throat, then smiled. Gently. It's a mild viral fever. Minjae let out a shaky breath. Nothing serious. The doctor shook her head. She's very young, so fevers are always frightening. But right now, she's stable. Keep monitoring her temperature. Make sure she drinks. If the fever rises significantly or she becomes difficult to wake, come back immediately. Minjae nodded so many times the doctor almost laughed. I understand. I'll watch her. Every minute. I believe you. After leaving the examination room, Minjae sat quietly in the waiting area. Haneul slept against his chest. The medicine rested safely inside the diaper bag. He still felt shaken. Taewon sat beside him. Neither spoke for several minutes. Finally, Minjae whispered, I was terrified. I know. I thought. His voice cracked. What if something happened? Taewon answered honestly. You'll probably think that every time she gets sick. Minjae laughed weakly. That's not comforting. It wasn't meant to be. It was true. On the drive home, Haneul slept peacefully. The medicine had already begun helping. Minjae relaxed just enough to notice how exhausted he felt. He leaned his head against the window. I forgot to thank you. Taewon glanced at him briefly. For what? The ride. You would have done the same. Maybe. No. Taewon smiled faintly. You definitely would. Back at the house, Bakya was already waiting. News traveled fast. Far too fast. She hurried toward them. How is my little angel? The doctor says she'll be alright. Oh, thank goodness. Without asking, Bakya marched into the kitchen. I'll make porridge. For you. Minjae smiled tiredly. Thank you. You haven't eaten, have you? No. I knew it. The rest of the day passed quietly. Haneul slept most of the afternoon. Minjae remained beside her crib. Every 15 minutes, he checked her temperature. Every few minutes, he leaned close enough to hear her breathing. By evening, the thermometer showed 37.4 degrees Celsius. Minjae smiled for what felt like the first time all day. There you are. His eyes stung unexpectedly. He hadn't realized how tightly he'd been holding his emotions together. A tiny hand reached from the crib. Haneul's fingers wrapped around one of his. She was still sleepy, but she smiled. Just a little. Minjae lowered his forehead gently against the edge of the crib. Thank you. He wasn't sure who he was thanking. Haneul, the doctor, Taewon, Bakya, maybe all of them. As the sun disappeared behind the mountains, Taewon quietly stopped by the front porch. He didn't knock. He simply left a small basket filled with fresh pears and a handwritten note. For Haneul, and for her father. Try to sleep tonight. Minjae found it a few minutes later. He smiled softly, then looked toward the neighboring house. The lights in Taewon's kitchen were glowing warmly through the trees. He whispered just loud enough for himself to hear. Thank you. Inside the little house, Haneul slept peacefully. Her fever had begun to fade. Minjae finally allowed himself to breathe. Today had reminded him of something important. Being a parent meant living with fear. But it also meant accepting help when that fear became too heavy to carry alone. And in Hidam-ri, he no longer had to carry it by himself. Chapter 11, The Harvest Festival. A week after Haneul's fever, life in Hidam-ri returned to its peaceful routine. Haneul was healthy again. She smiled more than ever. And Seo Minjae had finally stopped checking her temperature every 15 minutes. Maybe every hour is enough. Haneul kicked her tiny feet happily. I know. I'm still worrying, she answered with a cheerful coo. That Saturday morning, cheerful voices echoed through the village. Colorful banners hung across the streets. Long tables were set up in the square. Fresh flowers decorated every corner. Minjae looked out the window. What's going on? Just then, knock, knock, knock. He smiled before opening the door. Kong Taewon. Morning. Taewon stood outside carrying a basket of freshly picked apples. The harvest festival starts in an hour. The what? Taewon blinked. You didn't know. Apparently not. Before Taewon could explain, another familiar voice rang out. Minjae. Grandma Bakya marched into the yard carrying 3 reusable shopping bags. You haven't gotten dressed yet. I didn't know there was an event. She gasped dramatically. No one told you. No. She turned toward Taewon. You forgot. Taewon looked genuinely surprised. I thought someone else told him. Bakya sighed. Hopeless. She turned back to Minjae. The harvest festival happens every year. Everyone participates. Everyone eats. Everyone brings food. Everyone leaves with too much food. Minjae smiled. That sounds nice. It is. An hour later, Minjae arrived at the village square pushing Haneul's stroller. He paused. Wow. The square looked completely different. Rows of colorful tents lined the streets. Children ran between game booths. Fresh vegetables, fruits, homemade bread, and flowers filled long wooden tables. Someone played cheerful folk music near the stage. The entire village buzzed with laughter. Haneul stared around with wide eyes. So many new things. She kicked excitedly. I know. It is exciting. Within 5 minutes of arriving, Minjae had already been handed 1 bag of homemade cookies, 3 peaches, a loaf of bread, 2 jars of strawberry jam, a bouquet of wildflowers, and a knitted baby hat. I've been here for 5 minutes. Grandma Bakya laughed. That's normal. The village children immediately surrounded Haneul. It's the baby. She's here. One little girl carefully waved. Hello, Haneul. Another boy proudly offered a tiny paper windmill. For the baby. Minjae accepted it with a smile. Thank you. Haneul reached toward the spinning paper. Her eyes sparkled. The children cheered. She likes it. Meanwhile, Taewon had somehow disappeared. Minjae eventually found him near one of the tents. Or rather, he found Taewon carrying tables. Then boxes. Then sacks of rice. Then helping an elderly man fix a broken chair. Then climbing a ladder to hang decorations. Does he ever stop? The shop owner laughed. Not during festivals. Minjae approached him. You've been working all morning. Taewon shrugged. Someone has too. When are you going to enjoy the festival? I am. I like helping. Minjae shook his head with a smile. You're impossible. I've heard that before. Around lunchtime, a cooking competition began. Grandma Bakya proudly entered her famous soybean stew. The village erupted into friendly cheering. Go, Bakya. You'll win again. She folded her arms proudly. I intend to. Minjae whispered toward Taewon. Again. She's won 6 years in a row. Seriously. Nobody's brave enough to vote against her. They both laughed. Unfortunately, Grandma Bakya heard them. You too. Both men immediately looked innocent. Yes. You'll both be judging. Us. Yes. Neither dared refuse. The judging turned into complete chaos. Every grandmother insisted her dish deserved first place. Every grandfather insisted dessert should count twice. One elderly man secretly offered Minjae an extra dumpling. For fairness. I don't think that's how judging works. It helps. Taewon quietly accepted another dumpling. Minjae stared. You accepted it. I was hungry. You're hopeless. After lunch came the annual village relay race. Minjae wisely stayed far away. I'm pushing a stroller. No running. The village chief nodded. Reasonable. Taewon, however, found himself volunteered before he could protest. I didn't sign up. The children ignored him. Go, Taewon. Minjae couldn't help laughing. You deserve this. Taewon sighed. I knew you'd enjoy watching. I absolutely will. The race began. Taewon ran surprisingly fast. Very fast. The children cheered wildly. Even Haneul stared at the moving crowd with fascination. At the finish line, Taewon's team won by barely half a step. The children celebrated as though they had won a national championship. One little boy jumped onto Taewon's back. We won. Taewon laughed openly. A real laugh. Minjae paused. He had never heard that sound before. It suited him very well. As the afternoon slowly faded into evening, lanterns were lit around the square. Warm golden lights glowed beneath the trees. Music became softer. Families gathered together on picnic blankets. Minjae sat beneath a large oak tree with Haneul sleeping peacefully beside him in her stroller. He looked around quietly. Children laughed. Neighbors chatted. Grandparents shared homemade desserts. No one seemed rushed. No one looked at their phones. Everyone simply enjoyed being together. He hadn't experienced something like this in years. Taewon eventually sat beside him carrying 2 cups of warm tea. He handed one over. For you. Thank you. For several minutes, neither spoke. The silence felt comfortable. Finally, Minjae smiled. I'm glad we came. Taewon looked toward the lanterns. So am I. After another quiet moment, Minjae glanced at his sleeping daughter. I wanted her to grow up somewhere warm. He looked around the village. I think I chose the right place. Taewon smiled softly. I think you did. As fireworks gently blossomed above the village, colorful lights reflected across the night sky. Haneul stirred slightly but remained asleep. Minjae looked at the tiny sleeping face. Then at the villagers laughing together. Then at Taewon quietly watching the fireworks beside him. Without realizing it, he smiled. Not because everything in life was perfect. There were still difficult days. Sleepless nights. Deadlines. Unexpected fevers. Moments of doubt. But now, those moments were surrounded by something he hadn't expected to find. People. A place to belong. A village that had quietly welcomed a tired young father and his daughter without asking for anything in return. The fireworks faded. The stars appeared one by one. And beneath the peaceful countryside sky, Hidam-ri felt less like a place they had moved to, and more like home. Chapter 12, The Rainy Day Promise. Rain began before sunrise. Not the gentle drizzle Minjae had grown used to. This was a steady, endless rain that drummed against the roof and blurred the mountains beyond the windows. Seo Minjae peeked outside and sighed. I guess we're staying indoors today. Haneul, bundled in a soft yellow onesie, answered with a happy squeal from her play mat. You don't seem disappointed. She kicked both feet excitedly. I suppose everything is interesting when you're only a few months old. The house smelled pleasantly of freshly brewed coffee and warm porridge. Minjae had discovered that rainy days made writing easier. The sound of rain became a kind of background music. He settled at the dining table with his laptop. Just one page. He looked toward Haneul. And then it's your turn. She watched him with curious eyes. 30 minutes later, he had written exactly 1 paragraph. Because every few minutes, Papa. Well, not the word, but a tiny noise, a wiggle, a yawn, a sneeze. Each one immediately pulled his attention away. Minjae finally laughed. I've become wonderfully distracted. He closed the laptop. You win. Haneul rewarded him with a huge smile. Minjae spread a thick blanket across the living room floor. Today's mission was simple. Tummy time. Haneul had become much stronger. She lifted her head with surprising confidence. Then pushed herself up on both arms. Look at you. You'll be crawling before I know it. The thought made him pause. Actually, he looked around the room. The table corners, the bookshelf, the stairs. His eyes widened. I need to baby-proof this entire house. Haneul laughed. She clearly found his sudden panic amusing. Knock, knock, knock. 3 familiar knocks. Minjae smiled. It's open. Taewon stepped inside carrying an umbrella and a paper bag. Morning, morning. You came out in this weather. I was passing by. Minjae looked through the rain-covered window toward the neighboring orchard. You were working. Taewon shrugged. The trees don't care if it's raining. He held out the paper bag. Fresh bread. The bakery made too much. You keep saying that. They do. I'm starting to think you're inventing excuses. Taewon's lips curved into a faint smile. Maybe. Haneul noticed him almost immediately. She waved both tiny hands. Taewon crouched beside the play mat. Hello. She answered with a delighted giggle. Minjae folded his arms dramatically. She likes you too much. Taewon looked genuinely puzzled. Is that a problem? Maybe. I feed her. I carry her. I lose sleep. And then she smiles like that when you arrive. Taewon chuckled. I think she smiles like that because you're smiling. Minjae opened his mouth to argue. Then quietly closed it. Rain continued to pour outside. The windows fogged slightly from the warmth inside. Taewon glanced toward the stack of firewood near the back door. You'll need more before winter. It's still autumn. It'll come quickly. Minjae nodded thoughtfully. I've never had to prepare a house for winter before. I'll help. You don't have to. I know. You say that every time. And you still help. Yes. They both laughed. After lunch, the rain became even heavier. Thunder rumbled somewhere beyond the hills. Haneul startled at the sound. Her little face crumpled. Then, wah, Minjae immediately picked her up. It's alright. It's only thunder. She buried her face against his shoulder. Taewon quietly closed the windows to soften the sound of the storm. The room became warmer, safer, calmer. Within a few minutes, Haneul's crying faded. Minjae gently rocked her near the window. You were scared. I know. He smiled softly. So was Papa. He had always disliked thunderstorms. As a child, he used to hide beneath blankets. His grandmother would sit beside him until the storm passed. The memory warmed his heart. Taewon noticed the distant look in Minjae's eyes. What are you thinking about? My grandmother. He smiled. She always told me storms never lasted forever. Taewon looked out at the rain. She was right. Another rumble echoed across the mountains. This time, neither of them flinched. Later that afternoon, the electricity suddenly went out. Click. The entire house fell quiet. Only the rain remained. Minjae blinked. Well, I wasn't expecting that. Taewon stood immediately. I'll check the fuse. It's probably the whole village. Maybe. He grabbed a flashlight from a nearby drawer with surprising familiarity. Minjae raised an eyebrow. You already know where I keep the flashlight. You've only got one drawer in the kitchen. Right. A few minutes later, Taewon returned. The whole street is out. Minjae nodded. I suppose we wait. With no electricity, no television, and no internet, the afternoon slowed. They lit 2 candles. Their warm glow filled the living room. Minjae sat on the floor holding Haneul while Taewon quietly peeled apples for everyone. The rain softened little by little. The silence wasn't awkward. It was peaceful. Minjae looked around. I haven't had a day like this in years. No deadlines. No phone calls. No notifications. Just. He glanced at Haneul. Us. Taewon nodded. Sometimes quiet is enough. As evening approached, the power finally returned. The lights flickered on. Haneul clapped her tiny hands as if celebrating. Minjae laughed. I think someone approves. Taewon stood and picked up his umbrella. I should head home. The rain had almost stopped. Before leaving, he paused at the front door. Winter will be cold. Minjae nodded. I know. You won't have to figure everything out by yourself. Minjae looked at him. There was no hesitation in Taewon's voice. No expectation of thanks. Just quiet certainty. For a long moment, neither spoke. Finally, Minjae smiled. Then I'll be counting on you. Taewon's answering smile was small. But genuine. You can. That night, after putting Haneul to bed, Minjae stood on the porch. The rain had ended. The clouds drifted apart, revealing countless stars. The wet earth smelled fresh. Peaceful. Alive. He looked toward the neighboring house. A warm light glowed in Taewon's window. Not far away. Close enough that, somehow, it made the night feel less lonely. Minjae folded his arms against the cool breeze. So this, he whispered to himself, is what it feels like to have someone nearby. Inside the bedroom, Haneul slept soundly. Outside, the last raindrops fell from the trees. The storm had passed. And with it, another quiet day became another treasured memory in the little house where they were slowly learning to stay. Chapter 13, The Sleeping Neighbor. Autumn settled gently over Heedam-ri. The mountains were painted in shades of gold, orange, and crimson. Cool breezes drifted through the village every morning, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and ripe apples. Seo Minjae had come to love this season. Mostly because Haneul had finally started sleeping for longer stretches at night. 5 whole hours. He looked at the peacefully sleeping baby in her crib. I almost forgot what rested feels like. Haneul yawned in her sleep. I know. It won't last forever. That morning, Minjae decided to take a longer walk. The weather was too beautiful to stay indoors. He packed the diaper bag as usual. Extra clothes. Bottle. Blanket. Favorite stuffed rabbit. Ready. Haneul answered with an excited kick. I'll take that as a yes. Instead of heading toward the village, Minjae wandered along a narrow path behind the orchards. It was quieter there. Birds hopped between branches. Golden leaves floated gently to the ground. Sunlight filtered through the trees. Everything felt peaceful. Until, a ladder leaned against one of the apple trees. Below it sat a basket overflowing with freshly picked fruit. But there was no one around. Minjae frowned. That's strange. Then he heard it. A soft snoring sound. He followed it around the tree. And stopped. Kong Taewon was asleep. He sat beneath the largest apple tree, his back resting against the trunk. His straw hat had slipped over his eyes. One arm rested loosely across his chest. Apparently, he had fallen asleep during work. Minjae blinked. Seriously? Haneul stared curiously. Minjae whispered, I didn't know he could sleep. For several moments, Minjae simply watched. It was unexpected. Taewon always seemed busy. Always fixing something, helping someone, working somewhere. Seeing him asleep made him look surprisingly younger, less serious, almost peaceful. Minjae quietly smiled. You deserve the nap. Just then, a single apple dropped from the tree. Thunk. It landed beside Taewon. He didn't wake up. Minjae laughed softly. That's impressive. Another leaf drifted onto Taewon's shoulder. Still nothing. Haneul suddenly let out a happy squeal. Law. Taewon's eyes opened immediately. He blinked once, twice, then noticed Minjae standing nearby. Silence. Good morning. Minjae couldn't hold it in anymore. He laughed. It's nearly noon. Right. Taewon slowly removed the straw hat from his face. I wasn't sleeping. Minjae raised an eyebrow. No. I was resting my eyes. Under a tree. Yes. While snoring. I may have been asleep. I thought so. Taewon stood and stretched. His shoulders cracked loudly. I started harvesting before sunrise. Minjae looked at the overflowing baskets. By yourself. My uncle hurt his knee. So you've been doing all of this alone. For now. Minjae looked around. There were dozens of baskets waiting to be carried. That's a lot. It'll get done. Minjae wasn't so sure. Without thinking, he parked Haneul's stroller beneath the shade. I can help. Taewon blinked. I can carry baskets. You don't have to. I know. Minjae smiled knowingly. You say that every time. For the first time. Taewon laughed before answering. Fair enough. The work wasn't particularly difficult. Just repetitive. Carry one basket. Return. Carry another. Repeat. Minjae quickly realized something. This is heavier than it looks. Taewon nodded. I know. You do this every harvest. Every year. My respect for farmers has increased dramatically. Meanwhile, Haneul happily watched from her stroller. Whenever either man walked past, she waved her tiny hands enthusiastically. She's supervising again, Taewon said. Minjae chuckled. Our strictest manager. After carrying only 6 baskets, Minjae wiped sweat from his forehead. I'm tired. You've carried 6. Exactly. I've carried 23. I dislike you. You've said that before. I don't mean it. I know. Around lunchtime, Taewon spread a blanket beneath the same apple tree. I packed lunch. Minjae blinked. You carry lunch with you. I planned on eating. Reasonable. Taewon opened a simple lunchbox. Rice, grilled fish, pickled vegetables, kimchi. He split everything neatly into 2 portions. Minjae hesitated. I didn't bring anything. I noticed. I'll owe you. You don't. I insist. Then make coffee next time. Deal. They ate quietly beneath the trees. A cool breeze carried colorful leaves through the orchard. Haneul had fallen asleep in the stroller. Minjae looked around. This is nice. Taewon nodded. It usually is. I never imagined I'd spend my afternoon harvesting apples. I never imagined I'd be sharing lunch with a novelist. Life's strange. It is. After lunch, Minjae noticed Taewon rubbing his shoulder. Does it hurt? A little. You've been overworking. I'll rest tonight. Minjae frowned. You should rest now. I already did. You fell asleep sitting up. It worked. Minjae shook his head. Hopeless. By late afternoon, the last baskets had been loaded. The orchard looked noticeably emptier. Taewon let out a quiet sigh of satisfaction. Finished. Minjae smiled. We actually did it. We did. Taewon looked toward him. Thank you. The words were simple, but sincere. Minjae smiled back. You're welcome. As they walked home together, the sky glowed orange with the setting sun. Haneul slept peacefully after a day of fresh air. Minjae glanced toward Taewon. You know. What? I've only ever seen you helping other people. Taewon looked ahead. I don't mind. But, it's alright to let someone help you too. Taewon didn't answer immediately. After a long silence, he nodded once. I'll remember that. That evening, after bathing Haneul and putting her to bed, Minjae sat on the porch with a warm cup of coffee. The orchard beyond the fence was quiet. He smiled to himself. Earlier that morning, he had found his serious, dependable neighbor asleep beneath an apple tree. For some reason, That ordinary little memory made Taewon seem much more human. Less like someone who could handle everything. More like someone who also grew tired. Who also needed rest. And perhaps, someone who needed someone looking out for him too. The autumn breeze gently rustled through the trees. Inside the little house, Haneul slept peacefully. Outside, the stars slowly filled the countryside sky. And without either of them noticing, their lives had become woven together by countless small acts of kindness, one ordinary day at a time. Chapter 14, The Deadline. The peaceful morning began with a notification. Seo Minjae had just finished feeding Haneul when his phone vibrated on the kitchen table. He glanced at the screen. Editor Kong. He answered immediately. Hello, Minjae. His editor sounded relieved. You finally picked up. Minjae smiled apologetically. Sorry. Mornings are busy. I can hear that. Almost on cue, Haneul let out a happy little squeal from her high chair. Editor Kong laughed. Is that our youngest critic? She's my strictest one. After a few minutes of catching up, Editor Kang's voice became more serious. I've been holding your slot for months. Minjae quietly straightened. I know. The publisher is asking for your next manuscript. Minjae closed his eyes for a brief moment. How long do I have? A month. Silence. Only Haneul's cheerful babbling filled the kitchen. A month. Minjae repeated softly. I know it's tight, his editor continued. If anyone else asked, I'd refuse. But I believe you can do it. Minjae looked toward Haneul. She was happily chewing on a teething toy, completely unaware of the conversation. I'll do it. You don't have to force yourself. I'm not. He smiled faintly. I want to write again. After ending the call, Minjae sat quietly at the dining table. 1 month. Before Haneul was born, a month felt like forever. Now, a week disappeared in the blink of an eye. He opened his laptop. The cursor blinked patiently. He typed one sentence. Deleted it. Another sentence. Deleted again. He leaned back with a tired sigh. Nothing. A soft whimper came from the living room. Haneul wanted attention. Minjae immediately closed the laptop. I'm coming. He lifted her into his arms. You'll always come first. The words came naturally, without hesitation. Yet, a small voice inside him whispered another thought. When will you find time to write? The following days became a balancing act. Morning bottles, diaper changes, laundry, cleaning, cooking, naps, doctor's notes, short walks, and whenever Haneul finally fell asleep, Minjae hurried to his laptop. Sometimes he wrote 3 pages. Sometimes only 3 lines. Sometimes nothing at all. Late one afternoon, frustration finally won. Minjae stared at the blank screen. I used to do this so easily. He rubbed his eyes. What's wrong with me? His fingers hovered over the keyboard. But no words came. He wasn't just tired. He was afraid. Afraid his readers would think he'd lost his touch. Afraid he wasn't the same writer anymore. Afraid that becoming a father had somehow taken away the part of him that knew how to tell stories. He quietly lowered his head into his hands. I don't know how to do both. Knock, knock, knock. 3 familiar knocks. Minjae almost didn't answer, but he knew who it was. Taewon stepped inside carrying a basket of freshly picked pears. He paused the moment he saw Minjae's expression. Bad day. Minjae forced a smile. I've had better. Taewon placed the basket on the counter. Haneul. She's asleep. And you? Minjae looked at the laptop. I'm stuck. Taewon didn't ask about the manuscript. He simply sat across from him. The silence stretched comfortably between them. Finally, Minjae spoke. I haven't told many people this. He looked at the blank document. I'm scared. Taewon listened quietly. I spent years becoming a novelist. My books were everything. And now, he looked toward Haneul's room. Everything is different. I don't regret becoming her father. Not for a second, but sometimes. His voice softened. I wonder if I can still be the person I used to be. Taewon thought for a long moment before answering. Maybe you're not supposed to be. Minjae looked up. You left Seoul. You became a father. Your life changed. He spoke simply, without trying to sound wise. So why should your writing stay exactly the same? Minjae blinked. I've never thought about it that way. You've changed. That doesn't mean you've become worse. It only means. Taewon smiled faintly. You'll tell different stories now. The room fell silent. Minjae stared at the blinking cursor again. Different stories. He thought about sleepless nights. Tiny hands gripping his finger. The fear he felt during Haneul's fever. The joy of hearing her first laugh. The quiet kindness of a neighbor who always seemed to appear when he needed help. Without realizing it, his fingers began moving across the keyboard. One sentence, then another, then another. He didn't stop. An hour later, Minjae finally leaned back. 5 new pages. Not because he forced himself. Because he had something honest to write. He looked toward Taewon. I forgot you were still here. Taewon looked up from peeling pears. I noticed. You could have interrupted me. You were busy. Minjae laughed quietly. Thank you. What for? For sitting here. Taewon shrugged. I didn't do anything. You did. That evening, after Taewon returned home, Minjae stood beside Haneul's crib. She slept peacefully, hugging her little stuffed rabbit. He gently brushed a strand of hair away from her forehead. You know, he whispered. I've been trying so hard to become the father you deserve. He smiled. I forgot that maybe. I'm becoming a better writer because of you, too. Haneul sighed softly in her sleep. Outside, a light breeze rustled through the trees beyond the repaired fence. On the other side of that fence, Taewon quietly watered his orchard under the fading evening sky. Neither man realized it yet. But today marked another turning point. Minjae no longer saw fatherhood and writing as 2 lives pulling him apart. For the first time, he began to understand they could become part of the same story. Chapter 15, I Trust You. The deadline was 23 days away. Seo Minjae had made progress. Slow progress. Every afternoon, while Haneul napped, he wrote. Some days he managed 10 pages. Other days, only 1. He had stopped measuring success by numbers. Instead, he measured it by consistency. If I write a little every day. He smiled at Haneul, who was chewing determinedly on a rubber giraffe. We'll both grow. Haneul had grown noticeably stronger. She could now roll over on her own. It happened unexpectedly. Minjae had turned around for only a second to fold laundry. When he looked back, Haneul, she was lying on her tummy, looking immensely pleased with herself. His eyes widened. You did it. He hurried over and knelt beside her. You rolled over. Haneul answered with a delighted giggle. Minjae laughed so loudly that tears formed in his eyes. He grabbed his phone and recorded the moment. This one, he whispered. I'll watch this when you're 16. That afternoon, editor Kong called again. How's the manuscript? It's coming. You sound happier. I am. Writer's block. Minjae glanced toward Haneul. Not gone, but I think. I've stopped fighting it. His editor chuckled. I've been editing your books for 8 years. You know what changed? What? You've stopped trying to write like the old Seo Minjae. Minjae smiled quietly. Maybe. Keep going. I will. That evening, Minjae decided to water the vegetable garden before dinner. The tomatoes were thriving. The lettuce looked healthy. Even the herbs were growing well. Haneul sat safely in her stroller beneath the shade of the porch, happily watching her father. See, Minjae said proudly. We're keeping plants alive. I think that's impressive. Haneul squealed. I'll take that as applause. A familiar pickup truck stopped beside the fence. Taewon climbed out carrying several wooden boards. Building something? Minjae asked. A new storage shelf. For the orchard. He noticed the watering can in Minjae's hand. The tomatoes look healthier. I've been following your advice. It shows. Minjae couldn't hide his smile. Receiving praise from Taewon felt oddly satisfying. As they talked across the fence, Haneul began rubbing her eyes. Nap time. Minjae looked toward the house. I should put her down. Taewon nodded. I'll head home. But before either moved, Minjae's phone rang. Editor Kong. He hesitated. I should answer. Then looked toward the sleepy Haneul. She was becoming fussier by the second. Taewon quietly understood the dilemma. I can push the stroller. Minjae looked at him. What? Until you're finished. Silence. Minjae stared at his daughter. Then at Taewon. 3 months ago, the answer would have been immediate. No, absolutely not. But now, he thought about everything that had happened. The repaired fence, the fever, the orchard, the manuscript, the countless ordinary days. He slowly looked back at Taewon. Only around the yard. Taewon nodded. Of course. And if she cries, I'll bring her back. If she gets hungry, I'll bring her back. If she looks uncomfortable, I'll bring her back. Minjae smiled. You already know. I do. Very carefully. Minjae placed the stroller handle into Taewon's hand. It lasted only a second. But to Minjae, it felt enormous. His fingers hesitated before letting go. Taewon noticed. He didn't rush him. He simply waited. Finally, Minjae released his grip. I'll only be a few minutes. I know. Minjae stepped inside to answer the call. Editor Kong immediately launched into revisions, schedules, and publication dates. Normally, Minjae would have focused completely. Today, every few seconds, his eyes drifted toward the window. Outside, Taewon slowly pushed the stroller around the garden path. Not far, just enough for the gentle movement to soothe Haneul. He spoke to her quietly. Too softly for Minjae to hear. Haneul watched him with sleepy eyes. Within minutes, she fell asleep. Editor Kong noticed the silence. Minjae, sorry, you're distracted. A little. Everything all right? Minjae looked outside again. He watched Taewon stop the stroller beneath the apple tree to keep the sunlight off Haneul's face. Then he simply stood there, watching over her, patiently. Everything's all right. Minjae smiled. Actually, I think it's better than all right. When the phone call finally ended, Minjae hurried outside. Taewon looked up. Finished. Yeah. He walked over to the stroller. Haneul was sleeping peacefully. Exactly as promised. Taewon quietly stepped back. She fell asleep quickly. Minjae nodded. I can see. For a moment, neither man spoke. Finally, Minjae broke the silence. Thank you. Taewon smiled faintly. You're welcome. No. Minjae shook his head. I don't mean for watching her. I mean, he hesitated, for making it feel safe. Taewon's expression softened. He understood what those words truly meant. Minjae wasn't thanking him for 5 minutes of babysitting. He was thanking him for months of quiet consistency. For never asking for trust. Only earning it. As the evening breeze drifted through the garden, Minjae gently adjusted Haneul's blanket. Then he looked toward Taewon. You know. What? The first time you asked to hold Haneul. I refused. I remember. I thought. He laughed softly. I thought you were just an overly nosy neighbor. Weren't you right? Maybe a little. They both laughed. But now, Minjae looked him in the eyes. I trust you. The words were simple, quiet, honest. Taewon didn't answer immediately. After a long moment, he nodded. I'll do my best never to betray that. That night, after putting Haneul to bed, Minjae returned to his laptop. His fingers moved effortlessly across the keyboard. The words came easier than they had in months. Not because life had become easier. It hadn't. He still woke during the night. Still worried constantly. Still struggled to balance everything. But something fundamental had changed. For the first time since becoming a father, he no longer felt like he had to carry every burden alone. Beyond the window, the light in Taewon's house was still on. Minjae smiled to himself. Some relationships weren't built through grand confessions. They were built through hundreds of ordinary moments. A repaired fence. A shared lunch. A quiet ride to the clinic. A sleeping baby in a stroller. And one simple sentence that had taken months to say. I trust you. It wasn't love. Not yet. But it was the foundation upon which love could one day quietly grow. Chapter 16, The First Night Apart. The manuscript deadline was only 2 weeks away. For the first time since moving to Heedam-ri, Seo Minjae felt confident. Not because the manuscript was finished. It wasn't. But because he had finally found a rhythm. Haneul woke. He fed her. They played. She napped. He wrote. Day by day, page by page, both father and daughter were growing. That Monday morning, however, everything changed. Minjae's phone rang while he was washing Haneul's bottles. The caller ID read. Editor Kong. Good morning. Minjae, I have some good news and one request. Minjae laughed. Those two things usually come together. The publisher loves the first half of your manuscript. Relief washed over him. Really? They think it might become your best work yet. Minjae looked toward the living room where Haneul was happily reaching for her stuffed rabbit. I'm glad. But, the editorial meeting is in Seoul. His smile faded. Seoul, we'd like you there. For one day. After ending the call, Minjae sat quietly. One day. Just one day. Objectively. It wasn't a long trip. Emotionally. It felt impossible. He looked at Haneul. She had never spent a day away from him. Not even an afternoon. That evening, Bakya visited with freshly made side dishes. You look troubled. Minjae explained everything. When he finished, Bakya smiled gently. So that's all. That's all. Child, you thought something terrible had happened. I have to leave Haneul. For one day. Minjae nodded. I've never done that. Bakya sat beside him. Being a parent doesn't mean never letting anyone help. It means knowing who you can trust. Minjae lowered his eyes. I know. But knowing and doing are different things. They are. Later that evening, 3 familiar knocks echoed through the house. Taewon. As usual, he had come to return a borrowed gardening tool. Before he could leave, Bakya smiled knowingly. Perfect timing. Minjae immediately had a bad feeling. A few minutes later, the 3 of them sat around the dining table. Minjae explained about Seoul. Taewon listened quietly. When Minjae finished, silence filled the room. Finally, Taewon spoke. If you need me, I can help. Minjae looked down at his hands. He had trusted Taewon with Haneul for a few minutes. This was different. A whole day, maybe longer if the meeting was delayed. His chest tightened. He couldn't finish the sentence. Taewon understood. You don't have to decide now. I'm not asking because I expect you to. I'm asking because I know you're worried. His voice remained calm. If you decide not to go, I'll understand. If you decide to go, I'll do everything I can. That night, after everyone had gone home, Minjae sat beside Haneul's crib. She was already asleep. Her tiny fingers curled around the edge of her blanket. He smiled softly. You've never been away from Papa. His heart ached just imagining it. Then he remembered something. The fever, the orchard, the manuscript, the stroller. Every time he had needed help, someone had been there, not out of obligation, out of kindness. The next morning, Minjae walked next door. For the first time, he knocked on Taewon's door. A moment later, it opened. Morning, morning. Minjae took a slow breath. I've made my decision. Taewon waited patiently. I'll go to Seoul. Another pause. If. He looked directly at Taewon. If you'll stay with Haneul. Taewon nodded immediately. I will. Minjae laughed nervously. I already packed 3 bags. Taewon blinked. 3. 1 for clothes. 1 for bottles. 1 for emergency supplies. How many emergencies are you expecting? I don't know. That's why I prepared. Taewon's lips curved into a smile. I see. The rest of the week became preparation. Minjae wrote detailed notes. Feeding times. Nap times. Favorite lullaby. Which stuffed rabbit she preferred. Where the extra diapers were. Which bottle she liked best. How warm she preferred her milk. Bakya watched him write page after page. You're making a manual. I know. It has diagrams. I know. The night before the trip arrived, Minjae barely slept. He checked the bags twice. Then 3 times. Then quietly walked into Haneul's room. She slept peacefully. Completely unaware of tomorrow. Minjae gently kissed her forehead. I'll be back before you know it. The next morning, the village was still wrapped in mist. Taewon arrived exactly on time. He carried nothing except his usual calm expression. Minjae looked exhausted. You didn't sleep. Not really. I guessed. Before leaving, Minjae carefully handed Taewon the house key. It rested between them for a brief second. Then Taewon accepted it with both hands. Not casually. Respectfully. As though he understood exactly what it represented. It wasn't just a key. It was trust. Minjae looked at Haneul one last time. She smiled brightly at him from Bakja's arms. His heart almost gave in. I can still cancel. Bakja immediately shook her head. No, the meeting matters. And she'll be surrounded by people who love her. Minjae laughed weakly. You're all making this very difficult. The taxi arrived outside the gate. Minjae picked Haneul up one last time. She reached up and touched his cheek. He smiled through the tightness in his chest. Papa will come home tonight. He wasn't sure whether he was reassuring her. Or himself. As the taxi slowly drove away, Minjae looked back through the rear window. He saw Bakja waving. He saw Taewon standing quietly beside her. And in his arms, Haneul rested comfortably against his shoulder. Safe, calm, protected. Minjae took a deep breath. For the first time since becoming a father, he was spending a day away from his daughter. It hurt more than he expected. Yet deep inside, there was also something else. A quiet certainty. He had left Haneul with someone he trusted completely. And somehow, that made leaving possible. Chapter 17, Home is Waiting. Seo Minjae had never realized how long a train ride could feel. The trip to Seoul usually passed quickly. He would spend the journey reading manuscripts, outlining chapters, or staring absent-mindedly out the window. Today, he checked the time every 5 minutes. His phone buzzed. A message from Bakya. Bakya. She finished her bottle. Don't worry. Smile. Minjae smiled. A minute later, another message. This time from Taewon. Taewon. She's sleeping. Just 2 words. Simple. Enough to make Minjae breathe a little easier. The editorial meeting went better than expected. The publisher praised the manuscript. His editor smiled more than Minjae had seen in years. You've changed. Minjae laughed. So everyone keeps telling me. No. Editor Kong shook his head. I don't mean your writing. You used to look exhausted all the time. And now, you still look tired, but happier. Minjae thought about it, then smiled. I think you're right. The meeting ended earlier than expected. Editor Kong looked at him. Want to have dinner? Minjae didn't even hesitate. I should head home. His editor laughed knowingly. I thought so. You've become hopeless. I've become a father. I suppose that's the same thing. Before leaving Seoul Station, Minjae walked past a small toy shop. He stopped. Behind the glass sat a tiny plush cloud with a smiling face. Soft, round, ridiculously cute. Haneul would probably try to chew on you. He went inside anyway. A few minutes later, the plush cloud rested safely inside his bag. His first souvenir, not from a business trip. From being away from home. The return train felt much shorter. Mostly because his excitement grew stronger with every station. His phone buzzed again. This time, a photo. Taewon had sent it. Haneul sat on a blanket in the living room, clutching her stuffed rabbit while Bakya made funny faces just outside the frame. She was smiling so widely that her eyes had nearly disappeared. Minjae laughed out loud. Several passengers looked at him. He didn't care. He quickly typed. Minjae, tell her Papa's coming home. A moment later. Taewon. I already did. Back in Heedam-ri, the sun had begun to set. The taxi stopped in front of Minjae's house. Before the driver had fully opened the trunk, Minjae was already carrying his bag toward the gate. The front door slid open. Bakya appeared first. You're back. Then, Taewon stepped out, holding Haneul. The moment she saw Minjae, her eyes grew wide. For half a second, she simply stared. Then her tiny arms stretched toward him. Ah, Minjae laughed with relief. I'm home. He carefully gathered Haneul into his arms. She immediately buried her face against his shoulder. Then grabbed a fistful of his shirt. As expected, he whispered, You don't plan on letting go. She answered with a happy little squeal. His eyes became suspiciously warm. I missed you too. Bakya folded her arms with a satisfied smile. See, everything went well. Minjae nodded. It did. Taewon quietly handed him the neatly organized care notebook. Every feeding time had been written down. Every nap, every diaper change, even the amount of formula she'd finished. Minjae blinked. You wrote everything. Taewon looked almost confused. You told me to. Right, I did. That evening, after Bakya returned home, Minjae prepared dinner. Or rather, he tried to. Taewon stood nearby washing vegetables. You don't have to help. I know. You've been helping since yesterday. I know. You should rest. Taewon glanced at Haneul, who was happily playing on a blanket nearby. I'm all right. Minjae smiled. You're impossible. So you keep saying. Dinner was simple. Rice, vegetable soup, grilled fish, nothing fancy. Yet, it was the first meal the three of them had quietly shared in Minjae's house. Not as guests, not because of an emergency. Just because they happened to be together. Haneul sat in her baby chair, occasionally banging a spoon against the tray. Taewon looked over. I think she approves. Minjae laughed. Or she's conducting an orchestra. After dinner, Taewon prepared to leave. Before he reached the door, Minjae stopped him. Wait. Taewon turned. I bought something. He reached into his bag and pulled out a neatly wrapped package. It's not much. Taewon accepted it carefully. Inside was a sturdy leather notebook. The cover was embossed with a small apple branch. For Orchard Records. Minjae scratched his cheek awkwardly. You always seem to write everything on scraps of paper. Taewon opened the first page. Minjae had written a single sentence. Thank you for taking care of our home while I was away. Taewon looked at the words for a long moment. Then quietly closed the notebook. I'll use it well. Minjae smiled. I figured. A comfortable silence settled between them. Finally, Taewon spoke. Haneul cried once. Minjae immediately looked worried. When? This morning. What happened? She heard a train. Minjae frowned. A train. I don't know why. But after I carried her outside and showed her the mountains, she calmed down. Minjae looked toward his sleeping daughter. Maybe she was looking for me. Maybe. That night, after Taewon went home, Minjae stood beside Haneul's crib. She was sleeping peacefully again. The little plush cloud rested beside her stuffed rabbit. He smiled softly. He had worried endlessly before leaving. He had imagined every possible disaster. Instead, he had returned to a clean house, a happy daughter, finished manuscript revisions, and a heart that felt lighter than when he had left. He finally understood something. Going away for one day hadn't weakened the bond between him and Haneul. If anything, coming home had reminded him just how strong that bond truly was. He looked through the window toward the neighboring house. A warm light still glowed inside. Thank you. The words were carried away by the evening breeze. He wasn't sure if Taewon heard them. He didn't need to. Some gratitude didn't require an answer. Some feelings simply settled quietly into the heart, becoming another reason that home was no longer just a place. It was the people waiting for you when you returned. Chapter 18, Papa's Book. The manuscript was finished. Seo Minjae stared at the final page on his laptop. For a long time, he didn't move. Then, with a slow breath, he clicked send. The email disappeared. Just like that. Months of doubt, weeks of sleepless nights, countless stolen hours during Haneul's naps. Gone. He leaned back in his chair. It's done. From the play mat behind him came an excited squeal. Haneul clapped her tiny hands together as if she understood. Minjae laughed. I'll pretend you're congratulating me. An hour later, his phone rang. Editor Kong, you actually submitted it early. I know. I'm still shocked. So am I. His editor laughed. I've just finished skimming the ending. And, there was a brief silence. Then, I think this is the most honest novel you've ever written. Minjae looked toward Haneul. I think so too. That evening, Taewon arrived with fresh sweet potatoes. Before he could even greet him, Minjae opened the front door with an unusually bright smile. You finished it, Taewon said immediately. Minjae blinked. How did you know? You look lighter. Minjae laughed. Is it that obvious? A little. Over tea, Minjae quietly admitted. I couldn't have finished without everyone's help. Taewon shook his head. You finished it. We only helped. Minjae smiled. Maybe. But, sometimes, the people who help are part of the story too. Taewon looked down at his tea. He didn't answer, but the corners of his lips lifted. 2 weeks later, a delivery truck stopped outside the house. Minjae frowned. I didn't order anything. The driver carried a medium-sized box to the porch. Delivery for Seo Minjae. After signing, Minjae carefully opened it. Inside were 10 freshly printed copies of his new novel. For a moment, he simply stared. The cover was beautiful. His name rested quietly beneath the title. He gently picked one up. The pages smelled like fresh ink. He smiled. It's real. Haneul crawled closer, curious. She reached toward the book. No. Minjae laughed. This one isn't for chewing. She pouted dramatically. Taewon, who had stopped by after finishing work, quietly watched the scene. So this is the finished book. Minjae nodded. My first one. He looked at Haneul. Since becoming a father. Bakya arrived shortly afterward. Naturally. Someone in the village had already told her about the delivery. She held up one of the books proudly. Our novelist. Minjae rubbed the back of his neck. It's embarrassing. It shouldn't be. She smiled warmly. You worked hard. That afternoon, several neighbors visited. Not because Minjae was famous, but because they were happy for him. The shop owner brought rice cakes. The village chief brought tea. An elderly grandfather proudly declared, I don't read novels, but I'll buy one anyway. Everyone laughed. Later, when the house finally became quiet again, Minjae sat on the porch. One copy of the novel rested on his lap. Taewon joined him with 2 mugs of coffee. Neither spoke for a while. Finally, Taewon asked, May I read it? Minjae smiled. I was hoping you would. He handed him the first copy. Inside the front cover was a handwritten message. To Taewon, thank you for reminding me that stories change because people do. Taewon read the words slowly. then carefully closed the book. I'll treasure it. That night, after bathing Haneul and putting her to bed, Minjae quietly returned to the living room. One unopened copy remained on the table. He picked up a pen, opened the first page, then wrote carefully, "For Seo Haneul, you won't remember these days. The sleepless nights, the tiny apartment we left behind, the countryside, your first smile, your first fever, your first laugh, but I will. This book exists because you taught Papa how to begin again. I hope that one day, when you're old enough to read this, you'll know that every page was written with love. Papa." He gently closed the book. Not for today's Haneul, for the future. Before going to bed, Minjae stepped outside. The autumn air was cool. The orchard next door was quiet. Taewon's porch light was still on. He smiled softly. Months ago, he had arrived in Hidamri carrying nothing but grief, exhaustion, and fear. Now, his daughter was asleep inside. His manuscript had become a book. His little house was filled with laughter instead of silence. And beyond the fence lived someone who had quietly become part of every chapter of this new life. Minjae looked up at the stars. "I think," he whispered, "we're really home now." A gentle breeze stirred the trees. Inside the house, Haneul slept peacefully. Beside her crib, one signed copy of Papa's book waited patiently on the bookshelf. One day, she would read it. One day, she would understand. Until then, Minjae would keep writing, and he would keep raising the little girl who had unknowingly become the greatest story he had ever told. Chapter 19, The Family Portrait. Winter arrived quietly in Hidamri. The mornings were colder now. A thin layer of frost covered the vegetable garden. The mountains disappeared behind soft silver mist each dawn. Inside the little house, however, warmth filled every corner. The heater hummed softly. Soup simmered on the stove. And Haneul had discovered a brand new adventure. Crawling. Uh-oh. Seo Minjae laughed as he watched his daughter confidently crawl across the living room. "You're getting faster every day." Haneul giggled and continued toward the bookshelf. "Oh no, not the books." Minjae scooped her into his arms just before she reached the lowest shelf. "You've declared war on Papa's house." Haneul answered by patting his cheek. "That's unfair." He smiled anyway. Life had changed again, not because Haneul cried more, but because she wanted to explore everything. Every chair, every cabinet, every cushion, every slipper, every corner of the house. Minjae spent half his day following behind her. "I used to pray you'd grow stronger." He gently kissed her forehead. "I forgot that stronger also means faster." That afternoon, Grandma Bakya stopped by carrying a tiny knitted scarf. "I finished it." She carefully wrapped it around Haneul's neck. "Our little angel is ready for winter." Haneul immediately grabbed the scarf and tried to put it into her mouth. Bakya laughed. "Well, almost ready." Over warm tea, Bakya casually mentioned, "The community center is holding its annual family portrait day tomorrow." Minjae looked up. "Family portraits?" She nodded. "A photographer comes every winter. Families gather for new photographs. Many of us have one taken every year." Minjae glanced toward Haneul. "We've never taken a proper one." There were hundreds of photos on his phone, but none that truly felt complete. That evening, after Haneul had fallen asleep, Minjae opened a small storage box while looking for a photo frame. Inside were old letters, a few notebooks, and several photographs from years ago. He quietly looked through them. Some made him smile. Others brought back memories he wasn't ready to revisit. Near the bottom of the box rested one photograph. He held it for a long time. His expression softened. Then he carefully placed it back inside, closed the lid, and returned the box to the shelf. One day, Haneul would ask about her mother. When that day came, Minjae wanted to tell her the whole truth. But not yet. Not until she was old enough to understand. He looked toward the bedroom where Haneul slept peacefully. "Someday," he whispered. "I promise." The following morning, the community center buzzed with cheerful voices. Children wore warm knitted sweaters. Parents straightened scarves. Grandparents fussed over everyone's hair. Minjae arrived carrying Haneul, dressed in the cream-colored winter outfit Bakya had knitted for her. "Our little Haneul. She's crawling already. Look how much she's grown." Minjae smiled. "I hear that every week." "Because it's true." The photographer welcomed them warmly. "Next family, please." Minjae stepped forward carrying Haneul. As he looked at the simple wooden bench decorated with winter flowers, he suddenly hesitated. This would be their first real family portrait. Just him and Haneul. The photographer noticed. We're not in a hurry. Minjae smiled gratefully. Thank you. He sat down with Haneul on his lap. She immediately became fascinated by the camera instead of looking toward it. Everyone laughed. At that moment, the community center door slid open. Taewon entered carrying 2 boxes of oranges for the village gathering. One of the volunteers waved him over. As he crossed the room, Haneul spotted him. Her face immediately brightened. "Da." She stretched both tiny arms toward him. The nearby villagers smiled knowingly. Grandma Bakya chuckled. "I think someone wants to say hello." Taewon walked over. The moment he reached them, Haneul grabbed his sleeve and refused to let go. The photographer laughed. Looks like she has made her decision. Then he asked gently, "Would you like one photograph together?" Both men blinked. Before either of them answered, Bakya smiled. "I think that's a lovely idea." Several neighbors nodded. "You 3 are always together." Haneul clearly adores him. "It's only a picture." Taewon didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked at Minjae, waiting. The decision wasn't his to make. Minjae looked down at Haneul. One tiny hand held his finger. The other refused to release Taewon's sleeve. His heart softened. He smiled. "If you're all right with it." Taewon nodded. "I am." The photographer arranged them carefully. "Minjae, sit here. Taewon, stand beside him. Haneul in the middle." The little girl happily stood with support, laughing as she reached toward Taewon's scarf. Minjae couldn't stop smiling at her. Taewon smiled at Haneul. Neither of them looked directly at the camera. Click. The photographer lowered his camera. Perfect. He showed them the photograph. No one was posing perfectly. Haneul was laughing. Minjae was watching his daughter instead of the camera. Taewon was quietly smiling at both of them. It wasn't formal. It wasn't carefully planned. It simply captured a real moment. The photographer nodded with satisfaction. Sometimes, the best family portraits are the ones where everyone forgets they're being photographed. On the walk home, Minjae carried the framed photograph carefully. He found himself looking at it again and again. Taewon noticed. "You like it?" Minjae smiled. "I do. It's the first portrait Haneul and I have taken since moving here." After a brief pause, he added softly. "And I'm glad you're part of it." Taewon looked at the photograph. Then at Minjae. His smile was small, but genuine. "So am I." That evening, Minjae placed the framed picture on the bookshelf in the living room. Not hidden away, right where they would see it every day. Haneul crawled over almost immediately. She pointed excitedly at the frame. Then at herself. Then at Minjae. Then at Taewon. She giggled proudly. Minjae laughed. "Yes, that's all of us." He looked at the photograph one last time before turning off the lights. Months ago, this house had been unfamiliar. Quiet. Lonely. Now, its shelves held books. Its floors echoed with Haneul's laughter. Its kitchen welcomed neighbors without knocking. And its walls held the first family portrait of the new life they were slowly building together. It wasn't about replacing the past. It wasn't about forgetting it. It was about embracing the people who had become part of their present. In the warm glow of their little home, that single photograph quietly captured something precious. Not perfection, but belonging. Chapter 20, The House Where We Learned to Stay. The first snow of the year fell quietly over Heedam-ri. Tiny white flakes drifted past the windows of the little house, covering the garden, the repaired fence, and the orchard beyond. Inside, the fireplace crackled softly. Seo Minjae stood by the window with Haneul in his arms. "Look." He gently pointed outside. "It's your first snow." Haneul stared with wide, curious eyes. A tiny hand reached toward the glass as another snowflake landed against the window. She let out a delighted laugh. Minjae couldn't help laughing with her. "So that's your opinion. I think it's beautiful too." Life had settled into a gentle rhythm. The manuscript had been accepted. The publisher had already begun preparing the official release. Haneul continued to grow stronger every day. She crawled across the house with endless determination, pulling herself up against chairs and tables whenever she could. Every day brought something new. Every day reminded Minjae how quickly time moved. He found himself writing down little moments in a notebook. Haneul laughed at Snow. "She tried to steal my sock again." She smiled the moment she heard Taewon's voice. He smiled as he closed the notebook. I don't want to forget any of this. That afternoon, there was a familiar knock. 3 gentle knocks. Minjae opened the door without asking who it was. Taewon stood outside carrying a small wooden sled. I found this in the storage shed. He brushed the snow from it. It belonged to my younger cousin. Minjae blinked. It's still in good condition. I repaired it. He looked toward Haneul. I thought she might use it next winter. Minjae accepted it carefully. You kept this all these years. Taewon nodded. I couldn't throw it away. Minjae smiled. Then we'll treasure it. Grandma Bakya arrived not long afterward carrying warm sweet rice cakes. The 4 of them spent the afternoon drinking tea while snow continued to fall outside. The conversation wandered from harvests to books, from recipes to village gossip. Nothing extraordinary happened, and somehow, that made the day feel even more precious. As evening approached, Bakya prepared to leave. Before stepping outside, she looked back at the 3 of them. Minjae was kneeling on the floor helping Haneul stack wooden blocks. Taewon quietly repaired one of Haneul's loose toys with a small screwdriver. Neither man noticed Bakya watching. She smiled to herself. They looked good together. She whispered the words so softly that only the winter wind heard them. Then she went home. Later that night, Haneul finally fell asleep after a long day of excitement. Minjae carefully tucked her blanket around her. Good night. He gently kissed her forehead. I'm proud of you. Then he quietly stepped outside. Taewon was brushing snow from the front path. You'll freeze. Taewon looked up. So will you. Minjae laughed. Fair point. Without another word, they stood together beneath the softly falling snow. The village was peaceful. No traffic. No city lights. Only quiet. After a long silence, Minjae finally spoke. Do you remember the first day we met? Taewon smiled. You thought I was accusing you. You thought I was irresponsible. I did. And I thought you were unbelievably annoying. Taewon laughed. You told me that. I meant it. And now? Minjae looked toward the warm light shining through his living room window. Inside, Haneul slept peacefully. He thought about the broken fence. The fever. The orchard. The manuscript. The family portrait. The ordinary meals. The quiet conversations. The countless moments that had slowly changed his life. Then he looked back at Taewon. Now I'm grateful you knocked on my door. Taewon's smile softened. I'm glad you opened it. Another silence settled comfortably between them. It wasn't awkward. It never had to be. Minjae realized something. When he first came to Hidam-ri, he had believed he was searching for a house. A quiet place to raise his daughter. Somewhere to hide from the noise of his old life. Instead, he had found something far more valuable. People, kindness, friendship, trust, a community that had quietly accepted him without asking him to be anyone other than himself. And one neighbor who had never once asked to become important. He simply had. Before returning inside, Minjae looked up at the snow-covered roof. He smiled. You know what? I think I finally understand something. Taewon waited. This place. He looked at the little house glowing warmly against the winter night. Was never just a house. He glanced toward Haneul's bedroom window. It became the place where Haneul and I learned how to live again. Then he looked at Taewon. And where we learned we didn't have to do it alone. Taewon nodded quietly. I think so too. That night, after everyone had gone home, Minjae opened the notebook he had been carrying for months. On a fresh page, he wrote one final sentence. Home isn't the place where life becomes perfect. It's the place where, little by little, we learn to stay. He closed the notebook. The little house was silent. Outside, snow continued to fall. Inside, Haneul slept peacefully. For the first time in a long while, Minjae no longer felt like he was simply surviving each day. He was living it. And although tomorrow would bring new challenges, new worries, and new joys, he would face them with the family he had found. In the quiet countryside. In the warmth of a little home. In the house where they learned to stay. End of Chapter 20. End of Volume 1, A New Home. Thank you for listening to II Fiction Stories. Please like, comment, share and subscribe. See you next time.